Imagine a room dimmed by velvet curtain. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax and fatting potpourri. A single gas lamp hisses softly on a mahogany table. Outside, the London fog presses against the window like a ghost trying to find a way in. In her gloved hand she holds a small piece of cardstock. It is not the card itself that matters but the object pressed upon it, a single dried blossom, a heliotrope. To the uninitiated it is merely a flower, a scrap of nature pressed dead between paper, but to her eye it burns with meaning. It whispers, it accuses, it confesses. In this world a rose is not just a rose, a lily is never just a lily. They are words, they are sentences, they are secrets too dangerous to speak aloud, yet too urgent to remain silent. This is the paradox of the Victorian heart, an age of rigid corsets and starched collars, where a glimpse of an ankle could ruin a reputation and where love, true, passionate, desperate love, had to find a way to breathe. When the parlors were filled with watchful eyes and the walls seemed to have ears, the Victorians turned to the garden. They created a lexicon of petals, a dictionary of thorns. They spoke in blossom. But this was not merely a game for courting couples. It was a language of rebellion, a code of the damned. For the woman trapped in a gilded cage, for the man who loved unwisely, for the lover separated by class or by marriage vows, the tussy-mussy, that small, fragrant bouquet, was a loaded pistol wrapped in lace. It could declare devotion. It could deliver a snub so sharp it drew blood. It could say, "I love you," when the lips were sealed. Or it could say, "I am dying," when the cheeks still held their color. We stand today at the threshold of that silent world, a world where a flower could start a war between families or end a life of loneliness. We must tread softly, for we are walking through a garden where every bloom hides a heartbeat. Keep the candle lit. We have only just entered the garden. Let us open the door. It swings on well-oiled hinges without a sound. We step across the threshold, and the noise of the outside world, the clatter of hooves on cobblestone, the cry of the flower girl, the distant whistle of the train, falls away as if swallowed by silk. We are in the parlor. It is the heart of the Victorian home, and it beats with a terrible, regulated stillness. Look at the wallpaper, deep crimson, patterned with repeating birds that seem to fly but never move. Observe the mantelpiece, cluttered with curiosities under glass domes, stuffed finches, wax fruit, a coral branch from some distant sea. Everything is preserved, everything is displayed, and everything in its own way is a cage. The family sits in silence. Father reads his newspaper, the rustle of the page a thunderclap in the quiet. Mother embroiders by the fire, her needle puncturing the linen with small, precise stabs. The daughter, young and pale as milk, rests her hands in her lap. She does not speak unless spoken to. She does not meet the eye of the visitor. She is a porcelain figurine, painted with rosebud lips and glass eyes that see nothing. This is the age of the stiff upper lip, of the phrase "children should be seen and not heard," of emotions kept so tightly leashed that they seemed to vanish entirely. But they did not vanish. They simply went underground. For in this parlor, where every word is weighed before it is spoken, where a raised voice is a scandal, and a display of passion is a sign of poor breeding, how does the heart speak? How does a young woman tell her cousin that she is drowning in sorrow? How does a gentleman confess his love to a woman promised to another? How does a wife signal to her dearest friend that her husband's hand is heavy? She cannot use her voice. The walls have ears, and the walls are made of family. So she looks to the window, to the garden beyond the glass. And the garden answers. It begins quietly, a slip of paper pressed into a palm during a walk, a single stem left on a pew after Sunday service, a bouquet delivered by a trusted servant, wrapped in lace and tied with ribbon. To the father it is a pretty gesture, a bit of nature to brighten the drawing room. He does not see the heliotrope, the flower that whispers, "I adore you." He does not recognize the red chrysanthemum, that brazen declaration, "I love you truly." He sees only petals. He is blind to the poetry. But the daughter sees. Her fingers tremble as she holds the small bouquet, reading it like a letter. She notes the position of each flower, the way the ivy twines around the rose. "I am wedded to you. I follow you everywhere." The sprig of lavender buried deep. My devotion is silent, but it is constant. She must be careful. A single misplaced glance, a flush of the cheek, and the game is lost. She thanks the servant with a neutral nod. She carries the flowers to her room to press them in a book, to preserve the sentence they contain. Later, in the dark, she will decode them by candlelight. This is the world of Floriography, a world born of necessity. And it has a birthday. In the year 1819, a woman in Paris, a certain Madame Charlotte de la Tour, published a small book. Its title was Le Langage des Fleurs. It was not the first to suggest that flowers held meaning, but it was the first to codify it, to create a dictionary of the garden. The book was a sensation. It crossed the Channel to England like a fever. Soon, every young lady of breeding had a copy on her nightstand, its pages marked with ribbons, its margins filled with notes. By the 1840s, the industry had exploded. Publishers, sensing profit, rushed to print their own versions. The Language of Flowers by Frédéric Chaubrel, Flora's Lexicon by Catherine Waterman. Each book disagreed with the next. A rose meant love, but was it passionate love or spiritual love? A tulip meant a declaration, but of what? Fame or hopeless love? This confusion was not a flaw, it was a feature. For if you were caught sending a bouquet of yellow carnations, a flower that in some books meant disdain or "you have disappointed me," you could always claim innocence. But my dear Mrs. Whitmore, I consulted my dictionary, and in my dictionary the yellow carnation signifies gaiety. I merely wished to brighten your afternoon. The lie was a shield, the ambiguity was armor, and beneath the armor the message was delivered, sharp and true. The garden had become a post office, and every flower was a stamp, a salutation, a signature, a secret. Let us pause here, in the quiet of that parlor, and listen to the silence. It is not an empty silence. It is a full one. It vibrates with everything that cannot be said. The Victorians were masters of the unspoken. They built cathedrals of meaning out of the smallest gestures. The tilt of a fan, the placement of a glove, the way a gentleman offered his arm, and most potently the giving of a flower. Imagine the courage it took to walk into the garden to select a bloom, knowing that you were choosing a word, to cut the stem, knowing you were committing a sentence to memory, to hand it over, your fingers brushing, your heart pounding, your face a mask of polite indifference. It was a language for the brave, for the desperate, for the hopelessly, helplessly in love. And it was a language for the silent, for the women whose opinions were not sought, whose futures were decided by fathers and brothers, whose bodies were corseted, and whose minds were dismissed as too delicate for serious thought. For them, the flower was a voice. A single snowdrop past a friend said, "You are not alone, I see your sorrow." A cluster of purple lilac left on a grave said, "My heart is broken, but my love is not dead." A red rose, tied with myrtle, placed in a prayer book said, "If I cannot have you in this life, I will wait for you in the next." These were not decorations. They were declarations of war against silence. And as we stand here in this imaginary parlor, watching the firelight play across the wallpaper, we realize the truth. The flowers were not the message. The flowers were merely the ink. The message was the human heart, beating against its cage, desperate to be heard. The door closes behind us. We step back out into the fog, but we carry with us the scent of heliotrope, that sweet, cherry-like fragrance, and the knowledge that we have only just begun to learn the alphabet. The garden is vast, the night is long. The girl has retreated to her sanctuary. Her bedroom at the top of the house is the one place she is permitted to be alone. It is a small room, papered in faded blue, with a single window that looks out over the garden and views beyond. Here, by the light of a single candle, she opens the drawer of her writing desk. It is not a drawer filled with letters. Letters can be found, read, misinterpreted, used as evidence. No, this drawer contains something far more precious and far less incriminating, a herbarium, a collection of pressed flowers, each one carefully mounted on a page of thick cream paper, each one labeled with a date and a place. To her mother, it is a ladylike hobby, a testament to her delicate sensibility. To the girl, it is an archive of her heart. She turns the pages slowly. Here is a violet gathered on a walk last April. The violet speaks of modesty, of virtue, but in her private code, it marks the day he first spoke to her. Here is a sprig of rosemary for remembrance, pressed on the anniversary of her grandmother's death. And here, hidden between two sheets of blotting paper, a single rose petal, now brown and brittle as old silk. She does not need to consult a dictionary. She knows its meaning by heart. It was a white rosebud, and he gave it to her in the garden under the watchful eye of her governess. The white rosebud, in the language she has memorized, means too young to love. It was a warning, a gentle, heartbreaking reminder of the gulf between them. He, a young man of 20, she, a girl of 16, not yet out in society, not yet available for courtship. She pressed the petal anyway, because even a warning, if it comes from him, is worth keeping. This is the secret life of Victorian women, a life lived in margins and drawers, in pressed petals and hidden glances. They were the primary speakers of this floral tongue, not because men were incapable of learning it, but because women had the most to lose by speaking aloud. Consider the etiquette of the era. A woman could not write to a man who was not her relative or her fiancé. To do so was to invite ruin. She could not call upon him unaccompanied. She could not declare her feeling. She could only wait, patient, silent, blooming in place like the flowers in the garden, and hope that he would read the sign. But with flowers she could act. She could send a moss rosebud, confessing her love, without a single compromising word on paper. She could return his bouquet with a single withered flower hidden in the arrangement, a silent signal that his affections were not returned, that he should look elsewhere. She could communicate with her married sister, her exiled cousin, her friend in mourning, all without the family solicitor intercepting a single line of ink. It was a postal service run on photosynthesis, and it was, for a time, the only free press the heart possessed. The candle flickered. The girl closes her herbarium. Outside, the fog has thickened, wrapping the house in a muffled silence. She presses her forehead to the cold glass of the window, looking down into the darkness of the garden. She cannot see the flowers now, but she knows they are there, waiting, patient, ready to speak for her when the morning comes. The language of flowers was, at its heart, a language of survival. We must understand the stakes. In an era when a woman's reputation was her fortune, when a single whisper could close the doors of society forever, the ability to communicate without leaving a trace was not merely romantic, it was essential. A letter could be stolen, a confidence could be betrayed, a glance could be observed and misinterpreted, but a flower could be explained away. Surely you misunderstand, mother. It is merely a nosegay, a token of friendship. The yellow rose means friendship in the language of flowers. Everyone knows that. But everyone did not know that, because everyone consulted a different dictionary. This was the genius of the system. It was a code that shifted with the wind, a cipher that changed depending on which book you happened to purchase from the traveling salesman. The yellow rose might indeed mean friendship in one volume. In another, it meant jealousy. In a third, it meant infidelity. The sender and the receiver had to agree in advance on which dictionary they trusted. Or more dangerously, they had to rely on the common understanding, that fragile, unspoken agreement that bound all lovers in secrecy. And so the girl at the window, the young woman with the herbarium full of press secrets, she and her beloved had chosen their text. They had exchanged copies of the same edition, a small, leather-bound volume published in 1841 by a minor London press. It was a book small enough to slip into a pocket, innocuous enough to leave on a parlor table. No one would suspect that its pages contained the grammar of their rebellion. She had memorized it, of course. Every entry, every meaning. She knew that basil meant hatred and that borage meant bluntness. She knew that the cabbage rose was the ambassador of profit, while the camellia, smooth and perfect, whispered of unrequited love. She knew that to send a flower with a thorn meant a warning, and to send it without meant trust. But knowledge was only half the battle. The true art lay in the arrangement. A bouquet tilted to the left meant one thing, tilted to the right another. A flower presented with the right hand was a question, with the left an answer. The ribbon that bound the stems was a language unto itself. The knot, the color, the way the ends were trimmed, all of it carried meaning. It was a code so intricate, so layered, that a single tussy-mussy could contain an entire conversation, a debate, a declaration of war, or a plea for peace. Imagine the concentration required. The sender, standing in the garden at dawn, cutting each stem with trembling hand, arranging them in the precise order, checking the angle, the ribbon, the placement of the leaves, wrapping them in a damp cloth to keep them fresh, handing them to the servant with a carefully neutral expression. And then the wait, the agonizing hours until a reply came, or did not come. It was a courtship conducted in Morse code, using petals instead of dots and dashes. And like Morse code, it required patience, precision, and a faith that the message would arrive intact. The fog has lifted. Dawn creeps over the rooftops of London. In her blue-walled room, the girl sleeps at last, her hand resting on the closed cover of her herbarium. She does not know what today will bring. She does not know if a bouquet will arrive or if the silence will continue, but she knows, with the certainty of the young and the hopeful, that the garden will speak. It always does. For in a world where the tongue is tied, the flowers are the only honest witnesses. They do not lie. They cannot. They simply bloom, and in their blooming, they tell the truth that we dare not speak ourselves. The parlor is silent. The fire has died to ash, and somewhere in a garden across the city, a lover cuts a single stem and holds it to the light. The wind carries us east. It lifts us from the fog-choked streets of London, from the silent parlors and the pressed flowers hidden in drawers, and it sweeps us across continent, over the spires of Paris, the white peaks of the Alps, the sun-scorched plains of Greece. We travel until the architecture changes, until the domes rise and the minarets pierce a sky the color of heated brass. We arrive in Constantinople. The year is 1717, and everything is about to change. Here the air smells of spices we cannot name, cinnamon and clove, saffron and sumac. The calls to prayer echo from the mosques. The streets are a tumult of language, Turkish, Arabic, Greek, Persian. And in the hushed courtyards of the seraglio, behind walls that hide the most beautiful women in the empire from the eyes of all but one man, another language is being spoken, a language without sound. It is called selam. The women of the harem, the wives, the concubines, the daughters of the sultan, are the most closely guarded creatures on earth. They live in gilded captivity. They cannot receive letters, for letters can be intercepted. They cannot speak to men, for men are forbidden. They cannot leave, for the walls are high and the guards are vigilant. But they have found a way to speak. They send objects, a pear, a pinch of salt, a piece of straw, a burning ember, a flower. Each object carries a meaning agreed upon by tradition, passed down from mother to daughter, from odalisque to odalisque. A pear might mean, I am waiting. A burning ember might say, my heart burns for you. A flower, a hyacinth, a rose, a tulip, might whisper a name, a feeling, a question. It is a language of things, a poetry of the tangible, and it is from these silent women, these prisoners of beauty, that the seed of Victorian Floriography is carried west. The carrier is an unlikely messenger. She is an Englishwoman, a poet, a traveler, and she has just arrived at the gates of the seraglio. Her name is Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She is not a woman who silences easily. Born in 1689, she taught herself Latin in secret, wrote poetry that scandalized her family, and eloped with the man she loved against her father's wishes. By the time she arrives in Constantinople, accompanying her husband on his diplomatic posting, she has already lived a life that most women of her era could scarcely imagine. But Constantinople changes her. She is granted access where no European woman has gone before. She is invited into the baths, into the private quarters, into the hidden world of the Ottoman women, and what she finds there astonishes her. In a letter dated April 1, 1717, she writes to a friend in England. Her pen moves quickly, eager to capture the wonder of it. She describes the women of the harem not as prisoners but as poets. She describes their language, this secret correspondence of objects, this selam. She writes, I have got a Turkish love letter. It is a small box made of wood and divided into several compartments, each of which contains a separate object. There is a pearl, a clove, a jonquil, a piece of straw, a bit of coal, a rose, and a pinch of salt. The interpretation is as follows. The pearl means you are the fairest of all created being. The clove means you are the bud of my heart. The jonquil means I am consumed by love for you. The straw means I suffer. The coal means I burn, I sigh. The rose means may you be pleased to give me hope. And the salt means may you be pleased to give me comfort. She is enchanted. She sends copies of these letters back to England, describing the system in detail. She imagines the possibility. She plants a seed in English soil, a seed that will take nearly a century to bloom. For Lady Mary is not just recording a curiosity. She is translating a revolution. She is showing her countrymen and women that the heart finds a way, that when the tongue is tied, the hands can speak, that a flower can be a sentence, and a sentence can cross any wall. But the seed does not sprout immediately. Lady Mary's letters are published after her death in 1763. They circulate among the literary classes. They are read aloud in drawing rooms. They provoke curiosity, amusement, a certain Orientalist fascination with exotic customs of the, but the time is not yet ripe. The social pressures that will make floriography a necessity are still building. The corsets are not yet tight enough. The silences are not yet loud enough. Decades pass. Revolutions come and go. The guillotine falls in France. Napoleon rises and falls. The Industrial Revolution churns the English countryside into factory town, and slowly, imperceptibly, the walls begin to close around the Victorian heart. By the early 1800s, the conditions are perfect. The society is rigid. The rules are suffocating. The need for a secret language acute. And the publishers are watching. They remember Lady Mary's letters. They remember the Turkish selam. They see an opportunity. They begin to compile, to invent, to expand. They take the simple object language of the harem and they graft it onto the vast botanical knowledge of the age. They create dictionaries. They assign meanings to hundreds of flowers, meanings drawn from folklore, from classical mythology, from the shape and color and scent of the petals themselves. The result is a hybrid, a language born in the prisons of the Ottoman court, adapted for the prisons of the Victorian drawing room. The women of Constantinople passed objects through the grills of the seraglio. The women of London pass flowers across the tea table. The method is different. The impulse is the same. To speak when speech is forbidden. To love when love is a crime. To connect across the vast and terrible distance that society places between one human heart and another. Lady Mary, writing from her embassy in Constantinople, could not have known what she was unleashing. She thought she was sending a curiosity, a trifle, a charming anecdote for her friend. She was, in fact, sending a key that would unlock 1,000 silenced mouths. The wind that carried us east now carries us west again. We return to London, to the parlors and the garden, but we return changed. We have seen the source. We have heard the first whisper, and we know now that the language of flowers is not merely Victorian. It is ancient. It is human. It is the cry of the caged heart, echoing across centuries and continents, finding at last a petal to carry its voice. Let us remain for a moment in that liminal space, the threshold between East and West, between the old language and the new. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu returned to England chained. She brought with her not only the memory of the selam, but also the practice of inoculation against smallpox, a procedure she had witnessed in Constantinople and bravely tested on her own son. She was a woman who carried knowledge across borders, who refused to let custom stand in the way of progress. But the seed she planted, the idea of a language of objects, of flowers, lay dormant for decades, waiting for the right season. That season arrived in the early years of the 19th century. The Napoleonic Wars had ended. Europe was catching its breath. The Industrial Revolution was accelerating, flooding the cities with new wealth and new anxiety. The middle class was rising, and with it came a desperate hunger for respectability, for rules, for a code of conduct that would separate the refined from the rough. Etiquette books multiplied like rabbits. Manners became a science, and silence became an art. Into this atmosphere of controlled breath, the first flower dictionaries drifted like perfume through a cracked window. In 1819, as mentioned before, Madame Charlotte de la Tour published Le Langage des Fleurs in Paris. It was a slender volume, beautifully illustrated, and it claimed to reveal the secret meanings of the garden. It drew, indirectly, from the Turkish tradition that Lady Mary had described, but it also drew from something deeper, from the folk traditions of rural France, from the classical myths of Greece and Rome, from the medieval language of heraldry and the Renaissance symbolism of religious painting. The book was an immediate success. It was translated into English, German, Italian. It spawned imitators. By the 1830s, the language of flowers had become a cultural phenomenon, a necessary accessory for any young woman who wished to be considered accomplished, sensitive, and aware of the finer things. But here is the mystery that scholars still debate. How much of it was real, and how much was invented? The Victorians claimed that the language of flowers was ancient, traditional, handed down through generations of country folk. They pointed to the folklore of roses and lilies, to the old ballads where lovers exchange blossom, to the herbalists who ascribed virtues and vices to every plant. They presented their dictionaries as records of a living tradition, not creations of the publishing industry. And yet the dictionaries contradicted each other. A single flower could have half a dozen meanings, depending on which book you consulted. The primrose, for example, meant early youth in one dictionary, confidence in another, and I live and die with you in a third. The same flower, sent by the same lover, could declare innocence or eternal devotion, depending on the recipient's reference library. This was either chaos or it was freedom. For the women who wielded this language, the contradictions were not a flaw. They were a shield. They allowed for plausible deniability. They allowed the heart to speak in whispers, to test the waters, to retreat if the answer was not welcome. The ambiguity was the point. And so the Turkish selam, that language of necessity born in the prisons of the harem, was transformed. It became a language of choice, of art, of poetry. It moved from the seraglio to the parlor, from the hands of captives to the hands of ladies. But the core remained the same: the need to speak when speech is dangerous, to connect when connection is forbidden. Lady Mary, writing her letters in Constantinople, could not have imagined that her observations would spark a craze. She could not have known that the women of England would embrace this language so completely, would weave it into their courtships and their sorrows, would press flowers into books and hide meanings in bouquets. She was a witness, not a prophet, but she was the breeze that carried the seed. And now, as we stand in the gardens of Victorian England, we see what has grown from that seed: a vast and tangled thicket of meanings, of codes, of secrets. A language that is part Turkish, part French, part English invention. A language that belongs to no one, and therefore belongs to everyone who needs it. The breeze that carried us east has brought us home. But home, we now understand, is not so different from the seraglio. The walls are different, the guards are different, but the silence is the same, and the flowers are still speaking. The journey from Constantinople to London is not merely a journey of miles. It is a journey of translation. For the Turkish women of the seraglio, the objects they exchanged, the pearl, the clove, the burning ember, were not symbols in need of interpretation. They were the message itself. The pearl did not represent beauty. It was beauty, offered directly, without the mediation of words. The object and its meaning were one. But the Victorians, for all their love of flowers, could not resist the urge to categorize. They were, after all, the great classifiers. They named every beetle, every fern, every fossil. They built museums and filled them with glass cases. They took the living world and pinned it to cards, labeled it in Latin, arranged it in alphabetical order. And so they did with the language of flowers. The Turkish selam was fluid, oral, passed from woman to woman in whispered confidence. The Victorian flower dictionary was fixed, printed, bound in leather and sold for a shilling. It was a language captured in amber, a living thing, pressed between pages and preserved for posterity. But something is always lost in translation. What the Victorians gained in accessibility, anyone could now buy the code for a few pence. They lost in intimacy. The Turkish women's language was a secret shared among the few. The Victorian language was a commodity, available to anyone with the price of a book. It became a fashion, a fad, a drawing-room amusement. It lost some of its danger. And yet, for the young woman standing at her bedroom window, clutching a bouquet she dare not acknowledge, the dictionary in her pocket was not a commodity. It was a lifeline. It was the difference between speaking and silence. It was the key to a conversation that could cost her everything and was therefore worth everything. She did not care that the meanings were invented, that they varied from book to book, that the whole system was a commercial fabrication. She cared only that he had sent her a sprig of honeysuckle, and that in the dictionary they both used honeysuckle meant bonds of love. She cared that the ribbon was tied on the left, meaning, my heart is yours. She cared that the flowers were fresh, that they had been cut that morning, that his hands had touched the stem. The origin of the language did not matter. What mattered was that it worked. And so, as we stand at the end of this chapter, we must acknowledge a strange truth. The language of flowers was, in a sense, a beautiful lie. It was presented as ancient wisdom, as folk tradition, as the secret knowledge of the East. In reality, it was a marketing phenomenon, a product of the printing press and the publishing industry. But lies, when they are believed, become true. The women of Victorian England believed that the flowers could speak, and so the flowers spoke. They carried messages of love and hate, of hope and despair, of life and death. They crossed the boundaries that society had erected. They defied the fathers and the chaperones and the etiquette books. They gave voice to the voiceless. And they did it because, a century earlier, a curious Englishwoman had opened a door in Constantinople and looked inside. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu died in 1762, her letters unpublished, her legacy uncertain. She could not know that she had changed the way England would love. She could not know that the secret language of the harem would become the secret language of the parlor. She could not know that the flowers she admired in the gardens of the seraglio would one day bloom in the hearts of millions. But they did, and they bloom still. The breeze that carried us east has died to a whisper. We are home now in the fog and the silence, but we carry with us the scent of strange spices, the echo of a language older than words, the memory of women who spoke without speaking. The garden waits, the night deepens, and the flowers are ready to tell their next secret. Let us step now from the garden into the shop. The street is narrow, cobbled, perpetually damp. Gaslights flicker in the gathering dusk, and there between a haberdasher's and a tobacconist stands a small establishment with a bow window. In the window, arranged with careful artistry, is a display of flowers, not fresh flowers. They would wilt in the heat of the gaslight, but artificial ones. Silk roses, wax lilies, paper camellias painted in shades too perfect to. Above the door a painted sign reads, "Flower Merchants, Dictionaries sold within." Push open the door. Hear the little bell that announces your arrival. Smell the mingled scents of dried lavender, printer's ink, and the faint chemical tang of the dyes used to color the artificial bloom. The shop is small, cluttered, magical. Shelves line the walls, filled with books of all sizes, leather-bound volumes with gilt edges, cheap paper pamphlets with woodcut illustrations, pocket-sized editions meant to be carried unseen in a reticule. This is the engine room of the craze. This is where the language of flowers was not born, but manufactured. The proprietor looks up from his desk. He is a small man, neat, with spectacles perched on his nose and ink stains on his finger. He deals in two commodities, flowers that do not fade and words that pretend to be ancient. He is a florist and a fraudster, though he would not use the latter term. He would say he is a merchant of dreams, a purveyor of romance, a servant to the lovelorn, and he is about to sell you a dictionary. Which one will you choose? There are so many. The Language of Flowers by Frederick Schoebel, first published in 1834 and already in its 10th printing. Flora's Lexicon by Katharine Waterman, imported from America. The Flower Vase by Miss S. C. Edgarton. The Sentiment of Flowers by Robert Tyas. Each one different, each one claiming to be authoritative, each one contradicting the others on almost every page. You pick one at random, you pay your shilling, you tuck it into your pocket, and as you leave the shop, the little bell tinkling behind you, you do not realize that you have just purchased not a key to the truth, but a ticket to confusion. The proprietor smiles. He knows, he has always known. The contradictions are not a mistake, they are the point. For if everyone agreed on what the flowers meant, the language would be too dangerous. It would be too clear. A yellow carnation would always mean disdain, and a girl caught receiving one would be publicly shamed. But if the meanings are ambiguous, if they vary from book to book, then the recipient can always claim innocence. The sender can always claim ignorance. The language becomes a dance, a negotiation, a game of plausible deniability. And games, as every shopkeeper knows, are good for business. The customer returns tomorrow for another dictionary, and another next week. She builds a library of meaning, a collection of contradictions. She learns to navigate the chaos. She learns to choose the meaning that fits her heart. The florist and the fraudster have done their work. The language of flowers is no longer a folk tradition. It is an industry. Let us examine the product more closely. Take down from the shelf a copy of The Language of Flowers by Frederick Schoebel. It is perhaps the most influential of the early English dictionary. Schoebel was a journalist, a translator, a man of letters, not a botanist, not a poet, not a lover of garden. He saw a trend emerging in France and decided to adapt it to the English market. He borrowed heavily from Madame de la Tour, added some illustrations, and published. The book was a sensation. It sold thousands of copies. It was reprinted year after year. It established the template that all subsequent dictionaries would follow, an alphabetical list of flowers, each accompanied by a sentiment and often a verse of poetry to illustrate the meaning. But here is the secret that Schoebel never advertised. He made much of it up. Oh, he drew on tradition, certainly. The rose had meant love since the time of Sappho. The lily had symbolized purity since the Middle Ages. But what of the lesser-known flowers, the asphodel, the borage, the camellia. For these Schoberl and his imitators had to invent. They consulted herbalists, yes. They read classical mythology. But when the sources were silent, they simply assigned meanings that seemed appropriate, based on the flower's color, its shape, its fragrance, or simply on what would sell. The asphodel, for example, became associated with death because it grew in Greek graveyards. The borage, with its star-shaped blue flowers, was assigned the sentiment bluntness because its name sounded like borage, which someone decided meant rough courage. The camellia, smooth and perfect and scentless, became the flower of unrequited love, not because of any ancient tradition, but because it looked like the love that could not speak its name. Beautiful, flawless, and silent. It was a game of exquisite arbitrariness, and the Victorians loved it. They loved it because it gave them permission to feel. A young woman could not say, "I desire you," to a man she barely knew, but she could send him a tuberose, the flower of dangerous pleasures, and let the dictionary do the talking. If he was shocked, she could claim she had consulted a different dictionary, one where the tuberose meant purity or sweetness. The ambiguity was her armor, and the publishers knew it. They printed edition after edition, each one slightly different, each one offering new meanings, new possibilities. They created a market for confusion. They sold uncertainty as romance. The florist in his shop, the publisher in his office, the writer at his desk. They were not preserving an ancient tradition. They were building a machine that turned feelings into flowers and flowers into profit, a machine that ran on the human longing. And it ran beautifully. But let us not be too cynical. The machine may have been built by commerce, but it was powered by something deeper. The Victorians did not simply buy flower dictionaries because they were told to. They bought them because they needed them. The language of flowers answered a genuine hunger, a hunger for expression in a world that forbade it. Consider the case of a young woman named Elizabeth, whose diary survives in a county archive in the north of England. Elizabeth was the daughter of a clergyman, living in a small village where everyone knew everyone's business. She fell in love with a young man her father deemed unsuitable, a tradesman's son, with no prospects and no permission to court her. They could not write letters, they could not meet alone, they could not speak, but they could exchange flowers. Elizabeth's diary records in painstaking detail the floral correspondence she conducted over the course of a single summer. On June 3rd, she received a sprig of wild thyme, which in her dictionary meant activity. She interpreted this as a message that he was working hard, saving money, trying to improve himself. On June 10th, she sent him a marigold, pain, to let him know how much she suffered from their separation. On June 17th, he sent her a moss rosebud, confession of love, and she nearly fainted with joy. But here is the detail that matters. Elizabeth and her lover did not use the same dictionary. She used Schoberl, he used Tyas, and the meanings did not always align. The wild thyme that meant activity in her book meant thrift in his. The marigold that meant pain in her book meant despair in his. The moss rosebud that meant confession of love in her book meant superior merit in his. They were speaking different languages, and yet they understood each other perfectly. Because the flowers were not the message, the flowers were the excuse. The real message was in the giving, in the act of cutting the stem, of wrapping it in paper, of finding a way to send it. The meaning was not in the dictionary. The meaning was in the heart. Elizabeth and her lover never married. Her father forbade it and they eventually drifted apart. But her diary survives, a testament to that summer of silent conversation. And in its pages, pressed between the leaves, are the dried remains of those flowers. The thyme, the marigold, the moss rosebud, brown now, fragile, almost dust, but still speaking. The florists and the fraudsters sold the dictionary, but they did not sell the love. They could not manufacture that. They could only provide the tools, the raw materials, the excuse for connection. What the lovers did with those tools was their own miracle. The shop bell tinkled, the customer leaves. The proprietor returns to his desk, dips his pen in ink and begins to compile another dictionary. He will assign new meanings to old flowers. He will invent traditions that never existed. He will feed the machine. But somewhere, in a village far from the city, a young woman will press a flower into her diary, and the machine, for all its fraud, will have done its work. It will have helped her speak. Let us linger a while longer in the shop, for there is more to see. Behind the counter, stacked in neat piles, are the less reputable products of the flower dictionary craze. These are the cheap edition, The penny pamphlets, the broadsheets, the pocket-sized booklets sold by traveling peddlers at country fairs. Their paper is rough, their illustrations crude, their bindings held together with a single stitch of thread. They are aimed at those who cannot afford the leather-bound volumes on the shelf, the servant girl, the shop assistant, the laborers' daughters who have somehow learned to read and who dream, as all humans dream, of love. These cheap editions are where the fraudsters truly flourish. For if the respectable publishers like Schoberl invented meanings with a degree of restraint, the penny pamphlets invented with abandon. They assigned sentiments to flowers that had never before been part of the language, weeds gathered from hedgerow, wildflowers with no botanical name, blossoms that existed only in the fevered imagination of the anonymous hack writer paid by the word. Consider the love lies bleeding, a flower that actually exists. In Schoberl it meant hopeless but not heartless, a melancholy sentiment, suitable for a melancholy age. But in the penny pamphlets it meant, I have loved you since before the world began, or my heart bleeds for you unto eternity. Grandiose, impossible, thrilling. The servant girl who received a sprig of love lies bleeding from her young man could believe, for a precious moment, that she was the heroine of an epic romance, not a kitchen maid with sore hands and a narrow bed. And the young man who sent it, he had paid a halfpenny for the pamphlet and another halfpenny for the flower. He had invested almost nothing, but he had purchased, for his beloved, a moment of transcendence. This was the true genius of the fraudsters. They understood that the language of flowers was not about accuracy. It was about aspiration. It was about the gap between the life one lived and the life one dreamed. The servant girl could not have a carriage or a ball gown or a titled suitor, but she could have a flower that whispered of eternal devotion. She could hold it in her hand and pretend. The respectable classes mocked these cheap editions, of course. They called them vulgar, sentimental, degraded. They pointed out the botanical errors, the contradictory meaning, the execrable poetry that accompanied each entry. They laughed at the servant girls who clutched their penny pamphlets and dreamed impossible dreams. But the servant girls did not care. They had found a voice. They had found a language. They had found a way to say the things that their station in life forbade them to say. And sometimes, just sometimes, the language worked. There is a record in the archives of a London parish of a wedding that took place in 1847. The groom was a footman. The bride was a lady's maid. They had courted for 3 years, exchanging flowers and messages through the labyrinthine corridors of the great house where they both served. They had used a penny pamphlet bought from a peddler at the Michaelmas fair. They had built a world of meaning from its crude pages. On their wedding day, the bride carried a bouquet of flowers, each one chosen from that pamphlet. She carried love lies bleeding for eternal devotion. She carried honeysuckle for the bonds of love. She carried a single white rose, which in her pamphlet meant, you are the only one. And she carried, hidden among the other blooms, a sprig of rosemary, not for remembrance as the respectable dictionaries would have it, but for something else entirely. In her penny pamphlet, rosemary meant, you have rescued. The footman understood. He had rescued her from a life of silence, of service, of invisibility, and she had rescued him in return. The florists and the fraudsters sold them the words, but the lovers made the poetry. The shop grows dim as evening falls. The proprietor lights a lamp, and the flame catches the gilt edges of the expensive dictionary, making them glow like small fires. He is closing for the night, but before he does, he reaches under the counter and brings out a small box. It is plain, unlabeled, locked with a tiny brass key. He opens it carefully, almost reverently. Inside are letters, dozens of them, tied with ribbon, yellowed with age, addressed in careful handwriting to the flower merchant, or the keeper of the language, or simply to this shop by name. They are letters from customers, from lovers, from the broken-hearted and the hopeful and the desperate. They ask questions. They seek clarification. They pour out their hearts to a man who sells silk roses and contradictory dictionaries. Sir, one begins, I have sent a yellow rose to the young lady I admire, but she has not replied. In my dictionary, the yellow rose means friendship. In hers, it means jealousy. I fear I have offended her. What flower shall I send to apologize? Dear sir, another reads, my daughter received a tussy-mussy from a gentleman we do not know. It contained lavender, which I understand means devotion, and ivy, which means fidelity. But it also contained a single thorn wrapped in a leaf. What does the thorn mean? Is it a threat, A warning, should I be alarmed? To the flower merchant, a third begins in a trembling hand, I am in love with my husband's brother. I know this is wrong. I know I must not speak, but I cannot help it. Is there a flower that means I am silent for your sake? Is there a flower that means I will carry this secret to my grave? Please tell me. I am so alone. The proprietor reads each letter carefully. Sometimes he writes back, offering advice, suggesting flowers, gently guiding these lost souls through the thicket of meaning. Sometimes he does not. Sometimes the letters are too sad, too raw, too close to the bone. Those he places in a separate pile to be answered when he has the strength. He never throws them away. They are his archive, his congregation, his proof that the language works. For all his fraud, for all his invention, he has become something he never intended to be, a confessor, a keeper of secrets, a priest of the silent heart. He locks the box, extinguishes the lamp, and steps out into the fog. The shop is dark, the street is empty, but somewhere in 100 bedrooms across the city, his dictionaries are being read by candlelight. His flowers, real and artificial, are being pressed into diaries, tucked into prayer books, hidden under pillows. His words are being spoken, though no sound is made. The florists and the fraudsters built a machine, but the machine, once built, took on a life of its own. It became a living thing, fed by the hopes and fears of millions. It became a language, not the ancient language of folklore, not the exotic language of the East, but a new language born of commerce and longing, written in petals and thorns. And it spoke the truth, not the truth of botany or history, but the truth of the human heart, the truth that we all, in the end, want the same thing: to be heard, to be understood, to be loved. The flower merchant closes his door. The night deepens, and somewhere a young woman opens her dictionary and finds, at last, the words she has been searching for. The candle burns low in the merchant's shop, but we need not follow him into the night. Let us instead remain here in the dimming light and consider what we have learned. The language of flowers was, from its very beginnings, a paradox. It claimed to be ancient, but it was largely invented. It claimed to be universal, but it varied from book to book. It claimed to reveal the secrets of the heart, but it often concealed them behind a veil of ambiguity. It was, in short, a fraud, a beautiful, necessary, life-giving fraud. And perhaps that is the kind of fraud the world has always needed. For what is language itself if not a shared fiction? The word love is just a collection of sound, a scribble of ink on a page. It has no inherent meaning. We give it meaning by agreeing to use it, by investing it with our hopes and fears, by linking it to the moments in our lives when something inexpressible demanded to be expressed. The Victorians did with flowers what humans have always done with words. They made a deal. They agreed that this petal would stand for this feeling, and that thorn would stand for that warning. And because they agreed, it worked. The fraudsters who printed the penny pamphlets, the publishers who rushed competing editions to market, the hack writers who invented meanings for flowers they had never seen, they were not destroying the language. They were enriching it. They were adding new words to the lexicon, new possibilities for expression. They were giving the servant girl and the lady's maid and the footman a vocabulary they could call their own. And the respectable young ladies in their parlors with their leather-bound showgirl on the table beside them, they were part of the fraud too. They knew, on some level, that the meanings were arbitrary. They knew that the dictionary they consulted was not a record of ancient wisdom but a product of the printing press. And yet they believed. They chose to believe, because the alternative was silence. There is a word for this kind of belief. The Victorians called it fancy, the faculty of imagination, of make-believe, of seeing the world not as it is but as it might be. They valued fancy highly. They thought it was essential to a well-rounded soul. And the language of flowers was, above all, an exercise in fancy. A young woman receives a bouquet. She knows that the flowers are just flowers. She knows that the young man who sent them may have chosen them at random or on the advice of a shopkeeper or simply because they looked pretty. But she chooses to read them as a message. She chooses to believe that the rose means love, that the ivy means fidelity, that the lavender means devotion. She chooses to construct a narrative from petals. And in that choice, she becomes a poet. She becomes a creator of meaning. The fraud, if fraud it is a fraud she willingly embraces, because it gives her something that reality cannot. A sense of connection, a belief that she is seen and understood, a hope that love is possible. And sometimes, just sometimes, the hope is justified. The young man did choose the flowers with care. He did consult the dictionary. He did mean what the flowers said. The message arrives, intact and true, across the gulf of silence that separates one human from another, and two hearts, for a brief and shining moment, beat as one. The candle gutters. The shop is dark now, but outside, in the streets of the city, the language of flowers is being spoken in 1,000 silent conversations. A maid passes a sprig of rosemary to a footman. A lady receives a bouquet from a secret admirer. A mother presses a lily into her daughter's hand on her wedding day. A widow places a single rose on her husband's grave. The florists and the fraudsters have done their work. They have given the world a language. What the world does with that language is its own affair. And now, as we leave the shop behind, we carry with us a new understanding. The language of flowers was never about the flowers. It was about the need that flowers filled. It was about the human hunger for expression, for connection, for love. That hunger is real. That hunger is true. And any language that answers it, however invented, however arbitrary, however fraudulent, is a language worth speaking. The night deepens. The fog rolls in. But somewhere in a room lit by a single candle, a young woman opens her dictionary and begins to compose a message. She chooses her flowers carefully. She ties them with ribbon. She wraps them in paper. And as she works, she is not thinking about the fraud. She is not thinking about the contradictions. She is thinking about him. And that, in the end, is all that matters. Let us examine the object itself. It is small enough to cup in 2 palms. A nosegay, a posy, a tussy-mussy. The names are as delicate as the thing they describe. It begins with a circle of lace, stiffened with starch, frilled at the edges like the collar of a queen. Through this lace, the stems are threaded, their ends wrapped in silver wire and bound with ribbon. And rising from this foundation, like a dome of living color, are the flowers. A rose, perhaps, at the center. Surrounding it, rings of smaller blossoms. Forget-me-nots, heliotrope, lavender, sprigs of greenery, myrtle, ivy, rosemary tucked between the bloom. The whole creation is a study in containment, in order, in the triumph of art over nature. It is a garden in miniature, a world in the palm of a hand. But it is also something more. It is a sentence, a paragraph, a letter written not in ink but in petals, and like any well-written letter, it follows rules. It has a grammar, a syntax, a logic that must be learned if the message is to be understood. We must learn that grammar now. The tussy-mussy is not a random collection of pretty things. Every flower has its place. The center is the heart of the message, the subject, the main clause, the thing that must be said above all else. If the rose is at the center, the rose is the point. Love, devotion, secrecy. Whatever the rose means in the dictionary the lovers share, that meaning is the core of the conversation. The rings that surround the center are the modifiers, the adjectives, the subordinate clauses. They qualify the central message. They add context. They whisper the details that the rose, in its boldness, cannot convey alone. A ring of forget-me-nots says, "Remember me," but remember me in what context? Remember me as the one who loves you. Remember me as the one who waits. The flowers in the rings provide the answer. The greenery is the punctuation. Ivy, twinning through the stems, says fidelity. It is the period at the end of the sentence, the affirmation that the message is true. Rosemary says remembrance, the comma that pauses the thought, inviting reflection. Myrtle says marriage, the exclamation point, the declaration of hope. And the ribbon is the tone. Tied on the left, it says my heart is yours. Tied on the right, it says my heart is closed. The color of the ribbon adds another layer, white for innocence, red for passion, green for hope. The way the ends are trimmed, straight for certainty, angled for doubt, frayed for sorrow, adds yet another. A single tussy-mussy, no larger than a teacup, could contain a message of staggering complexity. It could declare love, confess fear, ask a question, and beg for patience, all in a single, silent gesture. It could start a conversation that might last for months, each bouquet answering the last, building a narrative that existed only in flowers and in the hearts of the two people who understood them. But to understand, they had to learn the grammar. They had to agree on the rules. And that agreement, that shared language, was itself a kind of love. Let us watch the construction of a message. It is dawn. A young man stands in his garden, a small pair of scissors in his hand. He is nervous. His hand trembles slightly as he reaches for the first flower. He has been planning this bouquet for weeks, consulting his dictionary, making notes, rehearsing the message in his mind. Now the moment has come. Now he must choose. He selects a red rose from the bush by the wall. Love. That is the core of his message. He places it gently in a small basket lined with damp moss. Now the modifiers. He wants her to know that his love is true, that it is not a passing fancy. He adds a sprig of ivy, fidelity. He wants her to know that he thinks of her constantly. He adds forget-me-nots, true remembrance. He wants her to know that his intentions are serious, that he hopes for a future with her. He adds myrtle, marriage. He pauses. Is it too much? Too bold? He does not want to frighten her. He considers removing the myrtle, replacing it with something softer, less demanding. But no, he is tired of pretending. He is tired of silence. He wants her to know. He adds one more thing, a single thorn hidden among the leaves. It is not a flower, but it is part of the grammar. The thorn says, I am afraid. It says, if you reject me, I will be wounded. It says, this love is not safe. It costs me something to offer it. He wraps the stems in a damp cloth. He ties the ribbon pale blue for hope on the left. He addresses the package to her, care of her maid who is in on the secret. And then he waits. The bouquet arrives at her house in the afternoon. She receives it in her room alone. She unwraps it carefully, her heart pounding. She sees the rose. She sees the ivy. She sees the forget-me-not. She sees the myrtle. She sees the ribbon tied on the left. She understands. But then she finds the thorn. She holds it in her palm, feeling its sharpness against her skin. She understands that too. He is afraid. He has risked everything. The answer she sends will determine not just the future of their courtship, but the future of his heart. She sits at her desk. She takes out her own dictionary. She begins to plan her reply. The grammar of the tussie-mussy is a grammar of the soul. It requires courage to write and courage to read. It demands that we put our feelings into visible form, that we offer them to another person, that we risk the wound that the thorn represents. It is not a language for the faint of heart, but for those who dare to speak it. It is the only language that matters. The grammar, however, extends beyond the arrangement of the flowers. It includes the manner of the giving. A tussie-mussy presented with the right hand asks a question. It is a query, a probe, a gentle testing of the waters. The recipient, receiving it with the right hand, gives an answer. With the left she defers. With both hands she accepts fully. A bouquet handed over with the stems pointing toward the giver means one thing, with the stems pointing toward the receiver another. The stems are the direction of the feeling, toward the self or toward the other. A lover who offers his bouquet with the stems pointing at his own heart is saying, I offer you my heart. One who offers with the stems pointing at the beloved is saying, I seek your heart. It is a subtle distinction, but in a language of subtleties it matters. And then there is the matter of the wrapping. A tussie-mussy wrapped in white paper speaks of innocence, in colored paper of passion, in newspaper of secrecy, the message hidden in plain sight disguised as something ordinary. A bouquet wrapped in silk is a declaration of wealth and status, wrapped in linen of simplicity and truth, wrapped in nothing at all, of desperation, of a love so urgent it cannot wait for wrapping. The Victorians understood that communication is never just about words. It is about context, about presentation, about the thousand small signals that surround the message and give it meaning. They built this understanding into their floral language. They made the act of giving as meaningful as the gift itself. Consider the chaperone. In a respectable household, a young lady could not receive a gentleman alone, but she could receive his flowers. And the way she received, the expression on her face, the quickness of her hand, the color that rose to her cheeks was itself a message. The chaperone, watching from her chair by the fire, might not understand the language of the flowers, but she understood the language of the blush. And so the lovers had to control even that. They had to learn to receive a declaration of eternal love with the same bland smile they would give to a potted fern. It was a performance, a play within a play. The flowers spoke one language, the face spoke another, the heart spoke a third, and somehow, through this cacophony of signals, the truth found a way to be heard. This is the genius of the tussie-mussy's grammar. It is not a simple code, easily cracked. It is a complex system, requiring study, practice, and a deep understanding of the other person. It is a language that, like any living language, evolves with each conversation. The lovers who spoke it became fluent together. They built a private dictionary, adding new meaning, new nuances, new gesture. They created a world that belonged to only the two of them, and in that world they were free. But grammar, once learned, can be subverted. The young woman at her desk, planning her reply to the bouquet with the hidden thorn, faces a dilemma. She loves him. She has always loved him, but she is not free. Her father has chosen another, a man of substance, of position, of approved respectability. The suit is not yet announced, but it is understood. The papers are being drafted. The settlements are being negotiated. She is, for all practical purposes, already promised. And yet her heart says no. She cannot write this. She cannot speak it. She cannot even hint at it, for the walls have ears and the servants have eyes. But she can send a flower. She opens her dictionary. She turns the pages slowly, considering each entry. She needs a flower that says, "I am bound, but my heart is free." She needs a flower that says, "Wait for me." She needs a flower that says, "If I cannot have you, I will have no one." The dictionary offers possibility. The violet says faithfulness, but faithfulness to whom? To him or to her father's choice? The meaning is too ambiguous. The ivy says fidelity, but again the question remains, fidelity in what? The white rose says, "I am worthy of," but that is not quite right. She does not need to prove her worth. She needs to prove her patience. She turns to the section on wildflowers, and there she finds it. The harebell. In her dictionary, the harebell means grief, but in the marginal notes she has added over the years, in the private code she has built with her beloved, the harebell means something else. It means I am bowed but not broken. It means I bend to the storm but I do not break. It means wait, endure, hope. She and her lover have created their own grammar. They have taken the public language and made it private. They have added meanings that exist only for the two of them, hidden in the margins of their dictionaries, whispered in the spaces between the printed words. The harebell in the public dictionaries is a flower of sorrow. In their private lexicon, it is a flower of resistance. She selects a single stem. She wraps it carefully with no other flowers, no ribbon, no adornment. The message is stark, simple, devastating. I am bowed but not broken. Wait for me. She gives it to her maid, who gives it to his servant, who delivers it at dusk. He receives it in his room alone. He sees the harebell. He understands. He does not reply for a week. She fears she has lost him. She fears he has given up. She lies awake at night, staring at the ceiling, imagining his face, his hands, the way he looked at her that last time in the garden. And then on the 8th day a small package arrives. It contains a single flower, a sprig of wallflower. In the public dictionaries, wallflower means fidelity in adversity. In their private lexicon, it means something more. I will wait as long as it takes. I will be here, against the wall, unseen but present when you are finally free. She presses it to her lips. She weeps. She places it in her herbarium next to the harebell, next to the rose with the hidden thorn. She has built a library of their love, a collection of silent declarations that will outlast any written letter, any spoken vow. The grammar of the tussie-mussy is not just a set of rules. It is a living thing, growing and changing with each conversation. The lovers who speak it become its author. They write new meanings into existence. They create a language that belongs to no one but themselves. And in that language, they are truly free. Let us consider for a moment the risks. Grammar, whether of words or of flowers, exists to create clarity. It is a system of agreed-upon rules that allows meaning to pass from one mind to another. But when the rules are too flexible, when the meanings are too private, clarity can dissolve into confusion. A message intended as a declaration of eternal patience can be read as a farewell. A harebell can become a grave, not a promise. The young woman who sent the harebell took a risk. She gambled that her beloved would remember their private code, that he would interpret the flower not as sorrow but as resistance. If he had forgotten, if he had consulted a different dictionary, if his servant had mislaid the flower or wrapped it in the wrong paper, the message would have failed. The love would have faltered. The silence would have swallowed them both. And sometimes it did. The archives hold records of such failure. Letters, diaries, fragments of memoirs that speak of bouquets misinterpreted, of meanings lost in translation, of love that died because a flower said the wrong thing. A young man sends a yellow rose, meaning friendship, but his beloved reads it as jealousy and rejects him. A young woman sends a sprig of lavender, meaning devotion, but her lover reads it as distrust and turns away. The language that was meant to unite them drives them apart. These failures are the dark side of the tussie-mussy's grammar. They remind us that communication, even at its most poetic, is never certain. There is always a gap between what we mean and what is understood. There is always the possibility of error. The flower, for all its beauty, is still just a flower. It cannot guarantee the heart's intention. And yet the lovers kept speaking. They kept sending their tussy-musses, their hidden thorns, their private codes. They kept taking the risk, because the alternative, silence, was worse. Better to be misunderstood than not to speak at all. Better to risk the wound than to live without the hope of love. This is the lesson of the tussy-mussy's grammar. It is a lesson in courage, in vulnerability, in the willingness to put one's heart into visible form and offer it to another person, knowing that it may be crushed, ignored, or misunderstood. The language of flowers is not a safe language. It is a language for the brave. And the Victorians, for all their reputation for repression, were brave. They dared to speak when speech was forbidden. They dared to love when love was dangerous. They dared to put their hearts into petals and offer them to the wind. The wind, as we know, does not always carry the message where it is meant to go. But sometimes, just sometimes, it does. And when it does, the tussy-mussy becomes what it was always meant to be. A miracle. A small, perishable, impossible miracle. A garden in the palm of a hand. A world of meaning contained in a flower. The grammar of the tussy-mussy has one final rule, perhaps the most important of all. It is the rule of impermanence. Flowers die. This is their nature. They bloom, they fade, they wilt, they crumble into dust. A letter can be kept for decades, hidden in a drawer, read and read until its words are memorized. A photograph can be preserved in an album, passed down through generations. But a tussy-mussy is a message written in water. It arrives fresh, fragrant, full of life, and within days it is gone. The Victorians understood this. They did not see it as a flaw. They saw it as essential. For a love that must be kept secret cannot leave evidence. A bouquet, once its meaning has been read and its message absorbed, must be disposed of. It cannot be kept in a drawer where prying eyes might find it. It cannot be left on a table where a mother might examine it. It must fade, and in fading it must disappear. The young woman who received the harebell and the wallflower knew this. She pressed them in her herbarium, yes, but her herbarium was itself a secret, hidden at the back of her wardrobe, covered by layers of linen. And even there, the flowers would not last forever. They would brown, crumble, lose their shape and color. Eventually, they would become dust. This was the price of speaking in flowers. The message was temporary. The love had to be renewed with each new bouquet, each new conversation. There was no permanent record. There was only the endless, fragile present tense of the heart. And yet, perhaps this impermanence was a gift. A love that must be constantly renewed is a love that stays alive. A message that fades must be spoken again. The lovers who spoke in flowers could not rest on past declarations. They had to keep sending, keep receiving, keep interpreting. Their conversation was a living thing, growing and changing with each exchange. It could not be archived. It could only be lived. The young woman in the twilight of her life would remember those flowers. She would remember the harebell and the wallflower, the rose with the hidden thorn, the myrtle and the ivy. She would remember the terror and the joy of each exchange. But the flowers themselves would be gone, returned to the earth, to the garden, to the cycle of death and rebirth that governs all living things. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the deepest truths are not meant to be preserved. Perhaps they are meant to be experienced, and then released like a scent on the breeze, like a petal on the stream. The grammar of the tussy-mussy teaches us this, that love is not a document to be filed, but a conversation to be continued. That the heart speaks not in permanent ink, but in the fragile, perishable language of living things. That the message, like the flower, is precious precisely because it will not last. We hold a tussy-mussy in our hands. We read its meaning. We understand its message. And then we let it go. We watch it fade. We accept that this moment of connection, this meeting of hearts across the gulf of silence, is temporary. And because it is temporary, it is precious. Because it will not last, it matters. This is the final lesson of the grammar. The flower speaks. The flower fades. The love, if it is true, finds a way to speak again. The young woman closes her herbarium. She places it back in the wardrobe beneath the linen. She blows out the candle. She lies in the darkness, listening to the sound of her own heartbeat. Tomorrow she will send another flower, and another, and another, until the silence is broken or until the silence is all that remains. The grammar of the tussie-mussy is the grammar of hope. It is the grammar of the heart, speaking in the only way it can. And it is enough. The garden at midnight is a different country. By day it is a place of order, neat paths, clipped hedges, flowers arranged in harmonious beds. It reflects the values of the age: control, discipline, the triumph of cultivation over wildness. But at midnight, when the moon casts long shadows and the gaslights are extinguished, the garden reverts to something older, something darker, something that refuses to be tamed. The flowers by moonlight lose their colors. The red rose becomes black. The white lily becomes a ghost. The lavender, which by day speaks of devotion, becomes a shadowy presence, its fragrance the only evidence that it exists at all. This is the garden of the forbidden. This is where the language of flowers turns dangerous. For not all flowers speak of innocent love. Not all bouquets carry messages that can be shown to mothers or shared with chaperones. Some flowers are coded for desire. Some speak of pleasures that cannot be named. Some are the vocabulary of the illicit, the secret, the shameful, and the sublime. The Victorians, for all their reputation for prudery, were experts in the forbidden. They built their society on the suppression of desire, and in doing so, they made desire more powerful. The things that could not be said became the only things worth saying. The loves that could not be acknowledged became the only loves worth having. And the flowers gave them a language for it. Consider the tuberose. By day it is a modest flower, creamy white, waxy, unremarkable, but at night it releases its fragrance. And that fragrance is unlike any other. It is heavy, intoxicating, almost narcotic. It fills the air with a sweetness that borders on oppression. It is the scent of surrender, of pleasure, of danger. In the language of flowers, the tuberose means dangerous pleasure. It is the flower of the forbidden. To send a tuberose is to say, I desire you in ways I cannot speak. It is to acknowledge that the love between you is not the love of parlors and chaperones, but the love of midnight and shadow. It is to cross a line from which there is no return. And yet it was sent, again and again, hidden in bouquets, wrapped in plain paper, delivered by servants who knew better than to ask questions. The tuberose traveled from garden to garden, from hand to hand, from heart to heart, carrying its dangerous message through the silent streets of the city. The young woman who received a tuberose knew what it meant. She knew that the man who sent it was not offering a respectable courtship. He was offering something else, something that could ruin her if discovered, something that could cost her everything. And sometimes she accepted, because the heart, even the most carefully guarded heart, longs for the forbidden, because desire, however dangerous, is not easily denied. Because the tuberose with its narcotic fragrance speaks a truth that the rose with its respectable declarations of love cannot touch. The garden at midnight is a different country, and in that country the tuberose is king. Let us walk deeper into the shadows. Beyond the tuberose, beyond the midnight garden, lies a territory even more dangerous. It is the territory of the flower that means I love you true, the red chrysanthemum. It is the territory of the flower that means your charms are engraved on my heart, the hyacinth. It is the territory of the flower that means I am consumed by love for you, the jonquil. These are not the flowers of courtship. They are the flowers of passion. They speak of a love that has moved beyond the tentative, beyond the hopeful, into the realm of the absolute. They are the flowers of the lover who can no longer pretend, who can no longer wait, who can no longer be satisfied with glances and hints and half-spoken truths. To send a red chrysanthemum is to declare yourself, completely, irrevocably. It is to say, I love you and I do not care who knows it. It is to burn your bridges, to cast aside caution, to embrace the risk of ruin for the sake of truth. And in a society where love was regulated, controlled, and commodified, such a declaration was an act of rebellion. The young woman who received a red chrysanthemum faced a choice. She could accept it, and in accepting, align herself with passion against propriety. She could reject it, and in rejecting, choose safety over love. Or she could hide it, press it in a book, and spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. The archives are full of such flowers, pressed red chrysanthemums brown with age, hidden in diaries and prayer books and Bible. They are the evidence of choices made and not made, of loves embraced and loves denied. They are the fossilized remains of passion, preserved in the amber of memory. But the archives also contain records of what happened when the red chrysanthemum was accepted. There is the story of a young woman in Bath, whose name has been lost but whose letters survive. In 1852, she received a bouquet containing a red chrysanthemum from a man her family deemed unsuitable, a painter, bohemian, penniless. She accepted it. She accepted him. They eloped to Italy, where they lived in poverty and passion until his death a decade later. Her letters speak of those years as the only years she truly lived. She never regretted the red chrysanthemum. She never regretted the choice. There is the story of a young man in Manchester, a clerk in a cotton mill, who sent a red chrysanthemum to a woman above his station. She received it, she understood, but she did not accept. She returned it with a single white rose. "I am worthy of you, but I cannot have you." He kept the white rose for the rest of his life. When he died, it was found pressed in his Bible, next to the verse about love that hopes all things, endures all things. The red chrysanthemum is a flower of risk. It demands everything and offers no guarantee, but for those who dare to send it, and for those who dare to accept it, it is the only flower that matters, because it speaks the truth, the dangerous, beautiful, terrifying truth of the heart. But the forbidden bloom is not always the flower of love. Sometimes it is the flower of hate. The Victorians, for all their emphasis on politeness, were masters of the subtle insult. They could wound with a glance, destroy with a whisper, annihilate with a well-placed silence, and they could do it with flowers. Consider the yellow carnation. In some dictionaries it means disdain. In others, "you have disappointed me." In still others, rejection. It is the flower of the snub, the brush-off, the cold shoulder. To send a yellow carnation is to say, without words, "I have no further interest in you. You are beneath my notice. Goodbye." Imagine receiving such a flower. Imagine the hope with which you open the bouquet, the anticipation, the flutter of the heart, and then the realization. The yellow carnation, the message of disdain, the end. It was a cruelty made possible by the language of flowers. A cruelty that left no trace, that could be denied, that could be explained away as a mistake, a misunderstanding, a misreading of the dictionary. The sender could always claim innocence. The recipient could only suffer in silence. And yet the yellow carnation was sent. Again and again. It was the weapon of choice for the jilted lover, the jealous rival, the disappointed suitor. It was a way of saying, without saying, what could not be unsaid. There is a record in a diary from 1845 of a young woman who received a yellow carnation from a man she had hoped to marry. She had been expecting a proposal. She had been planning her trousseau. She had been imagining their life together. And then the flower arrived. She wrote in her diary that night, "He has sent a yellow carnation. I do not need to consult the dictionary. I know what it means. I am dismissed. I am discarded. I am nothing to him. I have placed it in my herbarium next to the rose he sent last month. They will lie there together, the love and the disdain, for as long as I live. I do not know if I will ever recover." She did recover eventually. She married another, had children, lived a long life, but she kept that yellow carnation. It was a reminder, she said, of the danger of hope, of the risk of love, of the price of opening your heart to another person. The yellow carnation is the dark twin of the red chrysanthemum. It is the flower of the end, just as the red chrysanthemum is the flower of the beginning. Together, they span the full range of human feeling, from passion to disdain, from hope to despair, from love to hate. The forbidden bloom is not always the bloom of desire. Sometimes, it is the bloom of destruction, and the Victorians, with their genius for subtle cruelty, wielded it with precision. Let us return to the young woman with the herbarium, for her story is not yet finished. She has received the harebell and the wallflower. She has built her private lexicon, her hidden language of resistance. But the forbidden is not only the flower of desire or disdain. Sometimes, it is the flower of the impossible, the love that cannot be, the passion that must remain forever unspoken, because the object of that passion is forbidden by laws that no dictionary can overcome. She loves him, he loves her, but he is not of her class, or he is married already, or he is her cousin too close by blood to be acceptable, or he is her sister's husband, or he is a woman and the world has no name for such a love. The forbidden bloom for these lovers is not a choice. It is a condition of existence. They did not seek the impossible, it found them. and now they must navigate a world that offers them no place, no language, no future, except the language of flowers. In the margins of her dictionary, she has added entries that no publisher would print. A sprig of heather, plucked from the moors where they walked once, means I remember that day. A petal from the rose that grew by the window where he stood means I saw you there. A leaf from the tree under which they kissed, that single, stolen kiss, means that moment is my eternity. These meanings exist for no one but them. They are the grammar of a love that has no other grammar. They are the words of a language that has no other speakers. And they are dangerous. For if these meanings were discovered, if someone found the key to this private code, the love would be exposed. The lovers would be ruined, not for loving, but for loving the wrong person in the wrong way at the wrong time. The flowers that speak their truth become the evidence of their crime. And so they must be careful, more careful than the lovers who send tuberoses and red chrysanthemum. Those lovers, at least, love within the bounds of what society can imagine. They love across the gap of class, or across the obstacle of an unwanted engagement, but they love in ways that society recognizes, even if it does not approve. But the lovers who love impossibly, they love in ways society refuses to see. Their love is invisible. It does not exist. It cannot be spoken, even in flowers, except in a code so private that no one else can read. She presses a violet into her diary. In the public dictionary, it means faithfulness. In her private code, it means I will be faithful to you though the world says you are not real. She presses a sprig of rosemary. In public, remembrance. In private, I remember you though I must never speak your name. The herbarium grows. The secrets accumulate. The love, invisible to the world, becomes visible to her alone. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes the knowledge that the love exists, that it is real, that it is witnessed by the flowers and by the heart, is enough to sustain a life. The lovers may never be together. They may never speak aloud. They may never hold each other again. But the flowers remember. The pressed petals hidden in the drawer testify to a truth that the world denies. The forbidden bloom, in its deepest sense, is the bloom that must never be named. It is the flower of the love that has no place, no future, no hope. And yet it blooms. It always blooms. In secret gardens, in hidden hearts, in the margins of dictionaries where no one else will look. The young woman closes her herbarium. She blows out the candle. She lies in the darkness, listening to the rain against the window. Somewhere, across the city, across the distance that separates them, he is lying in his own darkness, thinking of her. The flowers know. The flowers remember. The flowers will speak when they can speak no other way. The forbidden bloom is the most honest flower of all, because it speaks the truth that cannot be spoken. It names the love that cannot be named. It blooms in the darkness, and in blooming it bears witness. The night deepens. The rain continues. And we must ask a question that the Victorians asked themselves, though they rarely asked it aloud. What happens when the forbidden bloom is the only bloom left? What happens when the love that cannot be spoken is the only love that has ever been real? The archives contain many answers to this question. They contain stories of lives lived in quiet desperation, of hearts broken and never mended, of loves that faded into the gray twilight of an obligation. But they also contain stories of courage, of lovers who refused to let the impossibility of their love destroy its reality, who found ways to be together, however briefly, however secretly, however dangerously. There is the story of two women in a small village in Yorkshire, whose names have been lost but whose grave markers remain. They lived together for 50 years, in a small cottage at the edge of the moors. To the village, they were spinsters, companions, old maids sharing a house to save expenses. But in the garden they planted together, the flowers told a different story. Roses for love, myrtle for marriage, ivy for fidelity, and in the center of the garden a single tuberose, the flower of dangerous pleasures. The neighbors did not understand the language of flowers. They saw only a pretty garden. They did not know that every bloom was a declaration, a vow, a celebration of a love that had no other language. When the first of the two women died, the second planted a white rose at the foot of her grave. In the language of flowers, the white rose means, I am worthy of. It was her final message, her last declaration, her eternal vow. When she died, 5 years later, she was buried beside her. The white rose still grows there, twinning around both headstones, binding them together in death as they could not be bound in life. The flowers spoke when the women could not. The flowers testified when the world refused to see. The flowers bloomed, and in blooming, they made the love visible. This is the power of the forbidden bloom. It does not ask permission. It does not seek approval. It simply blooms, bearing witness to the truth that the heart knows and the world denies. It is the language of the invisible, the voice of the silenced, the proof that love exists even when it has no place to exist. The young woman with the herbarium may never be with her beloved. She may marry the man her father has chosen. She may live a life of quiet respectability, bearing children, hosting dinners, growing old in the parlor where she once dreamed of another life. But the herbarium will remain. The pressed flowers will remain. The private code, the hidden meanings, the secret language of her heart, they will remain. And when she is gone, when the herbarium is discovered in a dusty attic by someone who does not know its secrets, those pressed flowers will still speak. They will speak of a love that was real, that mattered, that existed despite everything. They will speak of the forbidden bloom that bloomed in darkness and would not be denied. The rain stops. The moon emerges from behind the clouds. In the garden, the tuberose releases its fragrance into the night air. It is the scent of danger, of desire, of the love that cannot be named. It is the scent of the forbidden. And it is beautiful. The dawn comes slowly to the garden of the forbidden. First light touches the highest leaves, the tips of the roses, the edge of the garden wall. It creeps downward reluctantly, as if afraid of what it might reveal. The tuberose, exhausted by its night of fragrance, closes its petals. The moonflowers, which opened only in darkness, wilt in the first warmth of the sun. The garden returns to its daytime respectability, hiding the secrets that the night contained. But the secrets are still there. They are merely hidden. The young woman rises from her bed. She has not slept. She has spent the night with her herbarium, turning its pages, revisiting the flowers that chronicle her love. She has added a new specimen, a single petal from the tuberose that blooms outside her window. She has labeled it with a date and a single word, a word that exists in no dictionary: hope. She does not know what today will bring. She does not know if she will see him or hear from him or receive a flower that will change everything. But she knows that the garden is still there. The flowers are still there. The language is still there. And as long as the language exists, she can speak. This is the final truth of the forbidden bloom. It is not a flower of escape. It does not solve the problem of impossible love. It does not make the world accept what it refuses to see. But it does something almost as important. It makes the love real. It gives it a form, a voice, a presence in the world. It allows the lover to say, "This love exists. I am not crazy. I am not alone. The flowers know." And sometimes that is enough to live on. The Victorian era was an age of secrets. It was built on the foundation of the unspoken, the repressed, the denied. But the secrets did not disappear. They simply found other ways to express themselves. They found the flowers. They found the language of petals and thorns, of ribbons and stems, of bouquets delivered in secret and pressed in hidden books. The forbidden bloom is the emblem of that age. It is the flower that speaks what cannot be said. It is the love that cannot be named. It is the truth that cannot be told, except in the silent language of the garden. And we, looking back from our own time, can only wonder how many loves were lived in those silent gardens. How many hearts found each other in the language of flowers? How many forbidden blooms were sent and received, pressed and preserved, cherished and mourned? The archives give us glimpses. The pressed flowers in old books, the marginal notes in tattered dictionaries, the letters that speak of bouquets and meanings and messages that must never be explained, the graves where two women lie together, their love witnessed only by the white rose that binds them. But most of the stories are lost. Most of the loves are forgotten. Most of the forbidden blooms have crumbled to dust, their messages gone with, and yet the tuberose still blooms. Every night in gardens across the world, it releases its narcotic fragrance into the darkness. Every night it speaks the language of dangerous pleasure. Every night it reminds us that the forbidden is real, that desire is real, that love is real, even when the world refuses to see. The young woman closes her herbarium. She dresses for the day. She goes downstairs to the parlor where her mother waits with tea and conversation and the endless, stifling routine of respectable life. She smiles. She nods. She says the right thing. But in her pocket, hidden beneath her skirt, is a single dried petal. It is the petal of a tuberose. It is the proof that she is not only the daughter, the lady, the ornament of the parlor. She is also the lover, the dreamer, the woman who speaks the language of the forbidden. And as long as she has that petal, she is free. The light changes. It has been golden until now, the light of afternoon, of gardens in bloom, of hope and desire. But as we turn the page, the light fades to gray. The sun retreats behind clouds. The air grows cold. We are no longer in the garden of love, but in the garden of loss. The Victorians were intimate with sorrow. They lived in its shadow as we in our modern age do not. Children died before they reached their first birthday. Mothers died in childbirth. Young men died of fevers, of consumption, of wounds from wars fought in distant lands. Death was not a stranger who visited occasionally. It was a member of the family, a presence at every table, a voice in every silence. And they mourned. Oh, how they mourned! They mourned in black crepe and jet jewelry. They mourned in locked rooms and drawn curtains. They mourned for years, sometimes for the rest of their lives. And they mourned in flowers. For the language of flowers had a vocabulary for grief, a whole dictionary of sorrow, waiting to be spoken by those who had lost everything. Consider the marigold. In the language of love, it could mean pain or despair. But in the language of grief, it meant something more specific. I mourn you. It was the flower of the widow, of the orphan, of the parent who had buried a child. To place a marigold on a grave was to say, I am here. I remember. I will never forget. Consider the cypress. It is not a flower, but it belongs to the grammar of grief. The cypress tree, with its dark foliage and its association with graveyards, means mourning. To send a sprig of cypress is to say, I share your sorrow. It is the floral equivalent of a black armband, a visible sign of an invisible wound. Consider the yew. Even darker than the cypress, the yew grows in churchyards, its roots reaching down to drink from the bodies beneath. In the language of flowers, it means sorrow, but it also means something else. Eternity, for the yew is evergreen. It does not die in winter. It is the symbol of the soul that lives on after the body has returned to dust. The Victorians understood this duality. They knew that grief and hope were intertwined, that mourning and memory were two sides of the same coin. They expressed this understanding in the flowers they placed on graves, in the bouquets they sent to the bereaved, in the silent language of sorrow that only the grieving could fully understand. The young woman with the herbarium, she who has loved and hoped and dreamed, will one day know this language. She will press marigolds and cypress and yew between the pages of her book. She will add them to the collection of her life, alongside the roses and the harebells and the tuberoses. She will learn that love and loss are not opposites, but companions, that the heart that loves deeply is the heart that mourns deep, that sorrow is the price we pay for having loved at all. But that day is not yet here. For now, she still hopes. For now, she still waits. For now, the dictionary of sorrow is a book she has not yet needed to open, but it is there, waiting, as it waits for all of us. Let us visit a grave. It is in a churchyard in the countryside, far from the noise of the city. The church is ancient, its stones weathered by centuries of rain and wind. The graveyard surrounds it like a blanket, headstones leaning at angles, names worn away by time. But one grave is fresh. The earth is still dark, still mounded, still raw. A woman kneels beside it. She is young, younger than she looks. Grief has aged her. She wears black, as she will wear black for the next year, as custom demands. Her hands are gloved, but she has removed one glove to touch the earth, to feel the cold damp of it, to remind herself that he is really there beneath it, gone forever. In her other hand, she holds a bouquet. It is not a large bouquet. It is modest, intimate, meant for her eyes alone. She has arranged it herself in the greenhouse where they used to walk together, where he would name the flowers for her and tell her what they meant. She has chosen each bloom with care, speaking to him in the language they both loved. There is a white rose at the center. I am worthy of you. It is her declaration, her vow, her promise that she will live in a way that honors his memory. Around the white rose she has placed marigolds. I mourn you. This is the plain truth, the undeniable fact of her existence now. She mourns. She will always mourn. Sprigs of rosemary are woven through the stems. Remembrance. She will remember. She will not let him fade into the gray oblivion of the forgotten dead. She will speak his name, think of his face, hold him in her heart until she joins him. And at the edges, almost hidden, are a few leaves of yew. Eternity, because she believes or wants to believe that this is not the end, that somewhere beyond the grave, beyond the sorrow, beyond the cold earth, they will meet again. She places the bouquet on the grave. She whispers his name. She stays there, kneeling, until the light fades and the cold seeps through her clothes and the sexton comes to lock the gate. This is the dictionary of sorrow in practice. It is not a language of comfort. It does not ease the pain or fill the emptiness, but it is a language of connection. It allows the grieving to speak to the dead, to say the things that must be said, to maintain a conversation that death has interrupted. The Victorians believed in this conversation. They visited graves regularly, bringing flowers, tending the plot, keeping the memory alive. They sent flowers to the bereaved not as a hollow gesture but as a message. I remember with you. I mourn with you. You are not alone in your sorrow. The language of flowers gave them a way to say this. It gave them a vocabulary for grief that went beyond the inadequate words of condolence, the awkward silences, the helpless gesture. It allowed them to speak the unspeakable. The woman at the grave rises. She walks away, back to the life that must continue, back to the empty house, back to the long years of missing him. But she leaves behind the bouquet. She leaves behind her message. She leaves behind the flowers that speak when she cannot. And somewhere in the silence of the churchyard, the flowers begin their work. But grief is not only for the dead. The Victorians also mourned the living. There were loves that died before they could be born, engagements broken, courtships ended, affections withdrawn. There were marriages that became prisons, partnerships that turned to dust, families divided by estrangement. And for these losses, too, the language of flowers had words. Consider the yellow acacia. It means secret love. But in the dictionary of sorrow, it means something more. The love that died before it could be spoken. It is the flower of the might have been, the could have been, the should have been. It is the flower of regret. Consider the withered rose. A fresh rose speaks of love. A withered rose speaks of love that has faded, that has been betrayed, that has died from neglect. To send a withered rose is to say, "You killed our love. This is what remains." It is an accusation, a memorial, a reproach. Consider the dried white rose. In some dictionaries, it means death before sin. It is the flower of the woman who died pure, untouched, unsullied by the world. But in the dictionary of sorrow, it can also mean the death of innocence. The moment when a young woman realizes that the world is not kind, that love is not safe, that happiness is not guaranteed. The young woman with the herbarium will one day understand these flowers. She will understand the yellow acacia and the withered rose and the dried white rose. She will add them to her collection, not because she wants to, but because life will bring them to her, because loss is inevitable, because the dictionary of sorrow is the only dictionary that everyone in the end must learn to read. But for now, she still hopes. For now, she still believes that her love will triumph, that the obstacles will fall, that the future will be bright. For now, she is still innocent of the knowledge that sorrow brings. Let her keep that innocence a little longer. Let her live in the sunlight of hope before the gray twilight of grief descends. Let her press her harebells and her wallflowers and her secret roses, unaware that one day she will press marigolds and you. The Dictionary of Sorrow is not a book we choose to read. It is a book that chooses us. It opens itself at the moment of loss, and we have no choice but to turn its pages, to learn its meanings, to speak its language. It is the last dictionary we will ever need, and it is the only one we will ever wish we had never opened. The woman at the grave is gone now. The churchyard is dark, the headstones shadows in the moonlight. The bouquet she left is fading already, its petals beginning to curl, its colors beginning to dim. But the message is still there. The language is still there. The sorrow is still there, spoken in the only language that can contain it. The Dictionary of Sorrow is open, and it will not close. Let us enter a different kind of silence now. Not the silence of the churchyard, but the silence of the nursery. The room is preserved as it was the day she left it. The small bed with its white coverlet, the wooden toys on the shelf, the tiny dresses hung in the wardrobe, waiting for a body that will never fill them. The air is still, heavy with the scent of dried flowers. The flowers that arrived in the days after she died, brought by friends and neighbors who did not know what else to give. The mother sits by the window. She does not cry. She has no tears left. She simply sits, watching the light change, watching the days pass, watching the world continue as if nothing has happened. She holds something in her hand, a small bouquet, dried now, that she took from the child's grave on the day of the funeral. It contains a single snowdrop. In the language of flowers, the snowdrop means consolation. It is the flower of hope in the midst of despair, of light in the darkness, of the promise that spring will come again. But for this mother, the snowdrop means something else. It means she is gone and I must go on. It means the world expects me to be consoled, but I am not. It means I will carry this grief forever, and no flower can ease it. The Victorians had a name for this kind of grief. They called it inconsolable sorrow. It was the grief that refused to be comforted, that rejected the platitudes of friends and the rituals of mourning, that clung to the dead because letting go felt like betrayal. And for this grief, too, the language of flowers had words. Consider the everlasting flower, the helichrysum, the immortelle, the flower that does not fade. In the language of flowers, it means never-ending remembrance. It is the flower of the mother who will never forget, who will visit the grave every Sunday for the rest of her life, who will keep the nursery exactly as it was, who will speak to the empty bed as if the child could still hear. Consider the rosemary. We have seen it before for remembrance, but in the dictionary of sorrow, it means something more specific, remembrance unto death. It is the flower of the mourner who will carry the lost to the grave, who will never stop missing, who will die with the name of the beloved on their lips. Consider the asphodel. In Greek mythology, it grew in the meadows of the underworld, where the dead wandered in shadow. In the language of flowers, it means, my regrets follow you to the grave. It is the flower of the love that came too late, the apology that was never spoken, the word left unsaid until it was too late to say it. The mother by the window knows these flowers. She has read about them in her dictionary, the one she bought years ago, when she was a young woman dreaming of love. She never imagined she would need it for this. She never imagined she would be consulting the pages on grief, searching for a flower that could speak the particular shape of her loss. But here she is, and the dictionary is open. She turns the pages slowly, reading the entries she has avoided until now. The marigold for mourning, the cypress for sorrow, the yew for eternity. She considers sending a bouquet to her own heart, a message to herself, a reminder that she is not alone in her grief, but she knows with a certainty that hurts that she is alone, that grief is a solitary journey, that no flower, however eloquent, can truly share the burden. And yet she keeps the snowdrop. She keeps it pressed in her dictionary, marking the page where consolation is supposed to be found. She keeps it as a talisman, a reminder that the world once offered her comfort, even if she could not accept it. She keeps it because it is all she has. The nursery grows dark. The mother rises finally and closes the door behind her. She will return tomorrow and the next day and the next. She will always return. The room will remain unchanged, a shrine to the child who will never grow up. And the snowdrop will remain in the dictionary, pressed between the pages, speaking its silent message of consolation to a heart that cannot be consoled. But grief, like love, is not a single emotion. It is a landscape, vast and varied, with mountains of despair and valleys of acceptance, rivers of tears and deserts of numbness. And the language of flowers, with its infinite shades of meaning, mapped this landscape as thoroughly as it mapped the landscape of love. Consider the difference between the grief of a parent and the grief of a lover. The parent loses a future, all the years that might have been, the weddings and grandchildren, the joys and sorrows that will never come. The lover loses a present, the daily present, the shared moments, the small intimacies that made life worth living. The flowers recognized this difference. For the parent, there was the white lily. In the language of flowers, it means purity and majesty. But in the dictionary of sorrow, it means the innocent one who was taken too soon. It is the flower of the child who died before they could sin, before they could disappoint, before they could become anything other than pure potential. To place a white lily on a child's grave is to say, you are perfect now, frozen in innocence, untouched by the world. For the lover, there was the red poppy. In the language of flowers, it means consolation in sleep. But in the dictionary of sorrow, it means I will find you in my dream. It is the flower of the widow who visits her husband in sleep, who holds him in the darkness, who wakes each morning to the fresh pain of his absence. To place a red poppy on a lover's grave is to say, I will meet you in the country of dreams, where death cannot follow. And for those who grieved a love that was never fully realized, the courtship cut short, the engagement broken, the marriage that never happened, there was the faded rose. Not the withered rose of betrayal, but the faded rose of lost possibility. It means the love that might have been. It is the flower of regret, of nostalgia, of the life that could have been lived if fate had been kinder. The young woman with the herbarium does not yet know which of these griefs will be hers. She does not know if she will bury a child, or lose a lover, or mourn a love that never had the chance to bloom. She only knows that the dictionary of sorrow exists, and that one day she will need it. We all need it in the end. The dictionary of sorrow is the book we are all writing, page by page, loss by loss, grief by grief. It is the language we learn whether we want to or not. It is the vocabulary of being human. The mother in the nursery, the woman at the grave, the widow with the red poppy, they are all speaking this language. They are all adding their own meanings to its pages, their own flowers to its garden. They are all contributing to the great, sad, beautiful dictionary of sorrow. And when they are gone, when their grief has passed into memory and their flowers have crumbled to dust, the language will remain. It will be spoken by the next generation of mourners, the next wave of the bereaved, the next heart that breaks and needs a way to speak. The dictionary of sorrow is never finished. It is always being written, and we are all its author. There is one more flower in the dictionary of sorrow. It is the most important flower of all, and it is the most easily overlooked. It is the forget-me-not. We have encountered it before in the language of love, where it means true remembrance. But in the dictionary of sorrow, it means something else entirely. It means, do not forget me when I am gone. It is the flower of the dying, the last message of those who know they will soon leave the world of the living. The forget-me-not is small, blue, unassuming. It grows in damp places, along stream banks and in the margins of ponds. It does not demand attention. It does not compete with the rose or the lily or the tuberose. It simply exists, quietly, patiently, waiting to be noticed. And yet it carries the heaviest burden of all. It carries the plea of every human being who has ever faced death. Remember me. Do not let me disappear entirely. Keep me alive in your heart. Victorians understood this plea. They placed forget-me-nots on graves. They embroidered them on mourning clothes. They painted them on lockets that held a lock of hair from the departed. They wove them into the language of sorrow because they knew that, in the end, remembrance is all we have. When the grief has faded, when the tears have dried, when the mourning clothes have been put away, what remains is memory. And memory, like the forget-me-not, is small and blue and easily overlooked, but it is also eternal. The mother in the nursery, sitting by the window as the light fades, holds a forget-me-not in her palm. It came from the garden where her daughter used to play, where the child would chase butterflies and pick flowers and bring them to her mother with muddy hands and a gap-toothed smile. The forget-me-nots grew along the edge of the pond, and the child loved them best of all, because they were small enough to hold in her tiny fist. The mother presses the flower to her lips. She whispers her daughter's name. She promises, as she has promised every day since the funeral, that she will never forget, that the child will live on in her memory, that the small blue flower will bloom forever in her heart. This is the dictionary of sorrow. It is not a book of answers. It does not explain why the child dies or the lover leaves or the love fades. It does not offer comfort or consolation or hope. It offers only one thing, a language, a way to speak the unspeakable, a way to say the things that must be said, even when there is no one left to hear them. The young woman with the herbarium will one day add a forget-me-not to her collection. She will press it between the pages, next to the harebell and the wallflower and the tuberose. She will label it with a date and a name. She will look at it, sometimes, and remember. She will remember the one who said, "Do not forget me," and she will keep the promise, because that is what the forget-me-not asks of us. That is what the dictionary of sorrow teaches us. That in the end, after all the flowers have faded and all the messages have been read, the only thing that matters is memory. The only thing that lasts is love. The only thing that survives death is the heart that refuses to forget. The mother rises from the window. She leaves the nursery, closing the door softly behind her. She carries the forget-me-not with her, pressed in her dictionary, marking the page where the language of sorrow begins. And somewhere in a garden she cannot see, the forget-me-nots are blooming, small and blue and patient, waiting for the next mourner, the next broken heart, the next soul who needs to say the words that cannot be spoken. The dictionary of sorrow is open. It will never close. The door closes behind her with a sound that is soft and final. She hears the key turn in the lock. She hears the footsteps retreating down the corridor. She is alone now, in a room that is not her own, in a building she has never seen before, in a world that has decided she no longer belongs to it. The room is white. White walls, white ceiling, white floor. A narrow bed with white sheets. A single window high up, too high to see. There is no mirror, there are no flowers. She was brought here because she spoke the language of flowers too well. It began, as these things often do, with a bouquet. She had sent one to a gentleman, a perfectly innocent bouquet, she thought, a message of friendship and esteem. But the gentleman did not understand the language. He took the bouquet to her father, demanding an explanation. What did she mean by sending these flowers? What was she trying to say? Her father consulted a dictionary. He found that the flowers she had sent, a yellow rose, a sprig of lavender, a single white camellia, could be interpreted as a declaration of love. A love that was inappropriate, unseemly, impossible. A love that shamed the family. She tried to explain. She had used a different dictionary. In her dictionary, the yellow rose meant friendship, the lavender meant devotion, the camellia meant admiration. She had meant no harm. She had only wanted to be kind. But her father did not believe. He saw the flowers as evidence of a disordered mind. What kind of woman, he asked, communicates in secrets? What kind of woman invents her own meanings, her own language, her own reality? Only a mad woman. Only a woman whose mind has cracked under the pressure of too much feeling. And so she was sent here, to this white room, to this silence without flowers. The Victorians had a name for women like her. They called them hysterical, melancholic, deranged. They locked them away in asylums where doctors prescribed rest and isolation and the careful suppression of all feeling. They took away their flowers, their dictionaries, their language. They tried to cure them of the need to speak. But the need to speak is not a disease. It is the most human thing there is. And in the white room, without her flowers, she began to invent a new language. A language of shadows on the wall. A language of the patterns in the bedsheet. A language of the sounds she could hear through the walls. The cries of the other women, the footsteps of the nurses, the distant chiming of a clock that marked the hours she could no longer count. She would not be silent. Even here, especially here, she would find a way to speak. The asylum was full of women who loved flowers. This is not a metaphor. It is a fact, recorded in the admission records of Victorian asylums, preserved in archives that smell of dust and disinfectant. Under the column marked obsessions or delusions or peculiar habits, the doctors wrote the same word again and again. Flowers. Patient 47 believes she can communicate with flowers, spends hours in the garden speaking to the plants, claims the roses answer her. Patient 83 collects dried flowers and presses them in a book, refuses to explain the meaning of her collection, becomes agitated when the book is taken from her. Patient 112 sent inappropriate bouquets to several gentlemen, exhibits no remorse, insists the flowers were misunderstood. Patient 156 claims to have invented a private language based on flowers, cannot be persuaded that this language is imaginary. The doctors did not understand. They saw the flowers as symptoms, as evidence of a mind unhinged. They did not see what the women saw. A language, a connection, a way of being in the world that made sense. They did not hear what the women heard, the roses answering, the lilies whispering, the violets offering consolation. They heard only madness, and so they took the flowers away. In asylum after asylum, the gardens were locked. The patients were forbidden to pick flowers, to press them, to arrange them. Their dictionaries were confiscated, their herbariums burned. They were left in white rooms, with white walls, with nothing to look at but the white ceiling and nothing to hear but the sound of their own breathing. But the flowers did not leave them. The flowers lived on in their minds. A woman lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling, would see roses in the cracks of the plaster. She would trace their stems with her finger, count their petals, assign them meaning. This rose means love. This rose means loss. This rose means the one I left behind. Another woman, walking in the exercise yard, would find a single weed growing between the stones. She would kneel beside it, ignoring the shouts of the nurses, and she would speak to it. She would tell it her secrets. She would ask it to carry a message to the world outside. The weed had no meaning in any dictionary, but she gave it one. She gave it the meaning of hope. The doctors called this madness. They called it delusion, hallucination, fantasy, but perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was survival. Perhaps it was the human spirit, stripped of everything, finding a way to speak. Perhaps it was the language of flowers, blooming in the only place it could still bloom, the imagination. The woman in the white room, the one who was brought here for sending the wrong bouquet, lies on her bed and watches the shadows move across the ceiling. She is inventing a new language. She is finding a way to speak. And somewhere, in a garden she cannot see, the flowers are waiting for her to come home. Let us consider the case of a real woman, whose name has survived in the records of an asylum in Yorkshire. Her name was Margaret. She was admitted in 1863 at the age of 24. The admission record describes her as a person of delicate constitution and excitable temperament. It notes that she was obsessed with flowers and that she believed herself able to read messages in their arrangement. Margaret had been a governess. She had fallen in love with the master of the house, a man above her station. She had sent him flowers, using the language she had learned from a dictionary given to her by her mother. She had hoped he would understand. She had hoped he would respond. He did not respond. He showed the flowers to his wife. The wife showed them to the mistress of the household. The mistress dismissed Margaret without a reference, calling her forward and unbalanced. Margaret returned to her family, humiliated and heartbroken. She stopped speaking. She stopped eating. She spent her days in the garden talking to the flowers. Her family called the doctor. The doctor called the asylum, and Margaret was taken away. In the asylum, she refused to speak. She would not answer questions. She would not eat the food they gave her. She lay on her bed, staring at the wall for weeks on end. The doctors diagnosed her with melancholia and prescribed rest and isolation. But one day, a nurse noticed something. Margaret's fingers were moving. Very slowly, very carefully, she was tracing patterns on the bedsheet. The nurse watched for a long time before she understood. Margaret was drawing flowers. She was drawing roses and lilies and violets, invisible flowers, flowers made of nothing but movement and air. The nurse reported this to the doctor. The doctor was not interested. Delusional behavior, he wrote in the file, persistent floral hallucination. But the nurse was interested. She began to watch Margaret more closely. She noticed that the invisible flowers changed from day to day. Some days Margaret drew roses. Some days she drew harebells. Some days she drew flowers the nurse had never seen before, flowers that existed only in Margaret's mind. The nurse did not know the language of flowers. She did not know that the roses meant love, that the harebells meant grief, that the imaginary flowers meant hope or despair or longing. But she knew, somehow, that Margaret was speaking, that the moving fingers were not a symptom but a message, that the invisible flowers were a language, and that language was the only thing keeping Margaret alive. She began to bring Margaret real flowers, just small ones at first, a daisy, a dandelion, a sprig of clover. She placed them on the bedside table where Margaret could see them. She did not say anything. She simply left them there. Margaret looked at the flowers. She touched them. She held them in her hand, and slowly, very slowly, she began to speak. She told the nurse about the master of the house, about the flowers she had sent, about the language she had learned from her mother, about the dictionary that had been taken from her, about the world outside, the world she had lost, the world where flowers meant something and people could understand. The nurse listened. She did not judge. She did not call Margaret mad. She simply listened. Margaret never left the asylum. She died there in 1871 at the age of 32. But she spoke in the end. She found her voice. And she owed it to a nurse who brought her flowers and to the flowers themselves, who never stopped speaking, even in the silence of a white room. The language of the madwoman is the language of those who have been silenced. It is the language of those whose truth is too dangerous, too inconvenient, too real for the world to bear. It is the language of flowers, blooming in the cracks of the asylum floor, refusing to be uprooted. Margaret's invisible flowers are still there somewhere, traced on the air. They are still speaking. They are still waiting to be understood. Margaret's story does not end with her death. It continues, as all stories continue, in the lives of those who heard her. The nurse who brought her flowers, her name was Elena, never forgot the woman who drew invisible blossoms on the bedsheet. She left the asylum in 1872, a year after Margaret died, and she carried with her a small notebook. In it, she had recorded the flowers Margaret spoke of, the meanings she assigned them, the private language she had built in the years of her confinement. Eleanor did not fully understand what she had recorded. She was not a scholar of Floriography. She was simply a woman who had witnessed something mysterious. A mind, locked in silence, finding a way to speak through the only language it had left. She kept the notebook because it felt important, because it felt sacred, because it felt like a testimony to something that the world refused to see. Years later, Eleanor's granddaughter would find the notebook in an attic, among letters and photographs and the dried remains of flowers pressed between pages. She would read it with wonder, recognizing in its pages a story she had never been told, and she would add it to the archive, to the growing collection of evidence that the language of flowers was not merely a game, not merely a fashion, but a matter of life and death for the women who spoke it. The asylum records tell us that Margaret was diagnosed with melancholia and floral delusion. They tell us that she was incurable and unresponsive to treatment. They do not tell us that she was in love. They do not tell us that she was heartbroken. They do not tell us that she spent her final years drawing flowers on a bedsheet, trying to speak the only language she had left. But Eleanor's notebook tells us. It tells us that Margaret's invisible roses meant love, that her harebells meant grief, that her imaginary flowers, the ones that existed only in her mind, meant hope. It tells us that Margaret was not mad. She was simply a woman who had been silenced and who found a way to speak anyway. The language of the madwoman is the language of the unheard. It is the language of those whose truth is too inconvenient, too painful, too real for the world to bear. It is the language of the woman who loved the wrong man, who sent the wrong flowers, who spoke the wrong language. It is the language of the woman who was locked away because she dared to feel. And it is a language that, once heard, cannot be unheard. Eleanor's notebook survives today in a small archive in Yorkshire. It is fragile, its pages brown with age, its ink fading, but it is still readable. Margaret's flowers are still there, drawn in words, preserved in the careful script of a nurse who understood that some truths must be recorded, even when they cannot be explained. The language of the madwoman is not a language of delusion. It is a language of survival. It is the language of those who refuse to be silenced, even when the world has locked them away and thrown away the key. Margaret drew her flowers on the bedsheet until the day she died. She spoke her language in the only way she could, and somewhere in the silence of that white room, the flowers answered. But the asylum was not the only place where women were silenced for speaking the language of flowers. Consider the case of the flower ladies of London, the women who sold bouquets on street corners, in railway stations, outside theaters. They were poor, uneducated, invisible to the respectable classes. They carried their flowers in baskets, calling out to passers-by, offering a rose for a penny, a violet for a halfpenny. They were part of the urban landscape, as unnoticed as the pigeons of the fog. But they, too, spoke the language of flowers. They learned it from their customers, the gentlemen who bought bouquets to send to their mistresses, the ladies who sent coded messages to their lovers, the servants who carried tussy-musses through the back streets of the city. They learned which flowers meant love and which meant disdain, which meant hope and which meant despair. They became fluent in the silent language of the heart, and they used it. A flower lady standing on a corner might see a young woman weeping. She might approach her, offer her a flower, whisper its meaning. She might say, without saying, "I see your sorrow. You are not alone." She might become, for a moment, a confessor, a confidant, a friend. The respectable classes did not know this. They saw the flower ladies as nuisances, as beggars, as part of the urban decay. They did not know that these women were the keepers of the language, the translators of the heart, the ones who made the silent conversations possible. And when the flower ladies were arrested for vagrancy, for disturbing the peace, for the crime of being poor in a city that had no place for them, they were sent to prisons, to workhouses, to asylum. They were silenced, as Margaret was silent. Their baskets were taken from them. Their flowers were thrown away. But the language lived on. It lived in the memory of the women who had spoken it. It lived in the flowers that continued to bloom in the cracks of the city pavement. It lived in the hearts of those who had been touched by it. The language of the madwoman is also the language of the poor, the outcast, the forgotten. It is the language of those who have no other voice, no other way of being heard. It is the language of the flower lady on the corner, offering a rose to a weeping stranger. It is the language of the woman in the white room, drawing invisible blossoms on the bedsheet. And it is a language that will not die. It cannot die, because the need to speak, to connect, to be heard, is the most human need of all. And as long as there are humans, there will be those who find a way to speak, even when the world tries to silence them. The flower lady, released from prison, returns to her corner. Her basket is empty. She has no flowers to sell, but she stands there anyway, watching the crowds pass, waiting for the one who will stop, the one who will need her, the one who will understand that she too speaks the language of the heart. And somewhere in a garden she cannot see, the flowers are blooming, waiting, ready to speak again. Let us return, one final time, to the white room. The woman lies on her bed, staring at the ceiling. She has been here for years now. She has lost count of the days, the weeks, the months. The shadows move across the white walls, and she watches them, and she traces her invisible flowers on the bedsheet, and she waits. She waits for nothing. She knows this now. There is no one coming to rescue her. There is no gentleman who will suddenly understand the message she sent, no father who will repent of his cruelty, no doctor who will declare her sane and set her free. She will die in this room. She has accepted this, but she still traces her flowers, because the flowers are not about rescue. They are not about hope. They are about something deeper, something that cannot be taken away. They are about identity. They are about the self that existed before the white room, before the diagnosis, before the silence. They are about the woman she was and the woman she still is, even here, even now. She traces a rose, love. She loved once. She remembers what it felt like, the quickening of the heart, the warmth in the chest, the sense that the world was larger and brighter and more possible than she had ever imagined. They took that from her. They locked it away. But they cannot take the memory. They cannot take the rose she traces on the sheet. She traces a harebell, grief. She grieves for the life she might have lived, the children she might have had, the love that might have grown and flourished. She grieves for the woman she might have become. The harebell is small and delicate, easily overlooked, but it is there. It is always there. She traces a forget-me-not, remember me. She knows that no one will remember her. She will become a statistic, a case number, a footnote in the asylum records. But the forget-me-not asks anyway. It asks the universe to hold her in memory, to keep her alive in some way, somewhere, somehow. She traces a flower that has no name. It is her own invention, her own contribution to the language. It means I am still here. It means I have not given up. It means I am speak even if no one hears. The doctors call this madness. They call it delusion, hallucination, fantasy. They do not know that it is the opposite of madness. It is sanity preserved against all odds. It is the self refusing to be erased. It is the human spirit doing what the human spirit does best, finding a way to survive. The woman in the white room traces her flowers until her fingers are too tired to move. She closes her eyes, she sleeps. And in her sleep she dreams of a garden, a vast garden filled with every flower that has ever existed, every flower that has ever been imagined. She walks through it and the flowers speak to her. They tell her their name. They tell her their meaning. They tell her that she is not alone. She wakes, the white room is still there. The walls are still white, the door is still locked. But she has been to the garden. She has spoken with the flowers, and she carries that garden with her, inside her, where no key can reach it. The language of the madwoman is the language of the imprisoned. It is the language of those who have been locked away, silenced, erased. But it is also the language of those who refuse to be erased, who find a way to speak, even in the silence, who trace invisible flowers on the bedsheet, and in doing so declare that they are still here, still human, still alive. The doctors will never understand this. They will continue to call it madness. But the women know. The women have always known. The language of flowers is not a symptom. It is a survival strategy. It is a way of being human when the world has decided you are not human enough. It is a way of speaking when the world has taken away your voice. And it works. It has always worked. It will always work. The woman in the white room traces one last flower. It is a flower she has never seen, a flower that exists only in her imagination. She gives it a name. She gives it a meaning. She calls it freedom. And she smiles. Let us tell a story now. A single story, drawn from the thousands that the archives contain. It is a story of love conducted in silence, of messages sent and received, of hope hanging by the slender thread of a single petal. It is a story that could have happened, and perhaps did happen in some form in some city, in some year when the language of flowers was the only language that could speak the truth. We will call her Clara. Clara is 19 years old in the spring of 1848. She lives with her parents in a tall, narrow house on a quiet street in Bath. Her father is a solicitor, respectable, comfortably well off. Her mother is a former beauty, now faded into the background of her husband's life. Clara is their only child, their hope, their investment future. They expect her to marry well. Clara expects nothing. She has learned over the years that expectation leads only to disappointment. She has learned to keep her hopes small, her dreams hidden, her heart carefully guarded. But the heart is not easily guarded, and in the spring of 1848, Clara's heart begins to stir. She meets him at a dinner party. He is not the kind of man her parents would choose. He is a journalist, a writer for a small paper, a man with opinions and passions, and a way of looking at her that makes her forget to breathe. His name is Thomas. They speak for only a few minutes that evening. The conversation is ordinary, the weather, the latest novel, the quality of the wine, but something passes between them, something unspoken, something that Clara cannot name but cannot forget. A week later, a small package arrives at the house. It is addressed to Clara, in a hand she does not recognize. Her mother watches as she opens, her eyes sharp with curiosity. Inside is a single flower, a sprig of wild thyme. Clara's mother frowned. What is this? Who sent it? Clara does not know, but she has a dictionary. She has studied the language of flowers since she was a girl, though she has never had occasion to. She excuses herself, retreats to her room, and opens the book. Wild thyme, activity. She sits on the edge of her bed, the flower in her hand, and thinks. Activity. What does that mean? Is it a message about himself, that he is active, busy, engaged in the world? Or is it a message about her, that she should be active, should do something, should respond? She does not know, but she knows who sent it. She knows with a certainty that has nothing to do with logic that the flower came from Thomas. The lover's trial has begun. Clara does not respond immediately. She is cautious by nature, and her parents' vigilance makes caution a necessity. She waits. She watches. She wonders if another flower will come. It does. A week later, a second package arrives. This time, it contains a sprig of lavender, tied with a thin white ribbon. Lavender devotion. Clara's heart pounds. She hides the flower in her dictionary, pressing it between the pages devoted to the letter L. She writes the date in the margin, April 15, 1848. She does not know what to do. She does not know how to reply. But the flowers do not stop. Over the next month, she receives a sequence of messages, each one building on the last. A rosebud for confession of love, a sprig of myrtle for marriage, a forget-me-not for true remembrance, a white camellia for unrequited love. But this one puzzles her. Is he saying his love is unrequited? Does he think she does not love him in return? She does love him. She has loved him since that first evening, since the moment their eyes met across the dinner table. But she has not told him. She has not dared. She must reply. She knows this now. The flowers demand a response. The conversation cannot be one-sided forever. But how? She cannot send a bouquet directly. Her parents would intercept it, would question it, would put a stop to the correspondence before it could begin. She needs a messenger. She needs someone who can carry her flowers to him without being seen. She finds her messenger in the kitchen. The maid, a girl named Mary, is young and kind and loyal to Clara in a way that servants are not supposed to be. Clara has been good to her, has given her cast-off clothing, has spoken to her as a person, has treated her with a kindness that Mary has not forgotten. When Clara confides her secret, Mary agrees to help, and so the correspondence begins in earnest. Clara sends a sprig of white heather. Protection. She wants him to know that she is guarded, that she must be careful, that their love must remain hidden. He replies with a sprig of ivy. Fidelity. He will be faithful. He will wait. He will not betray her trust. She sends a red tulip. Declaration of love. It is the boldest message she has sent, the most dangerous. If her parents found it, if they understood its meaning, she would be ruined. But she sends it anyway. She sends it because she cannot keep the words inside any longer. He replies with a moss rosebud. Confession of love. The circle is complete. The love is declared, acknowledged, returned. The lovers' trial is not over, it has only just begun. But Clara and Thomas have crossed the first threshold. They have spoken, they have been heard, and the flowers have carried their words across the silence that separates them. But the trial, as all lovers discover, is never simple. Clara's parents have begun to notice. Not the flowers, those are hidden, carried by Mary, received in secret, but Clara herself, her distraction, her dream, the way she stares out the window, waiting for something they cannot see. Her mother questions her. Is there something you are not telling us, Clara? Some gentleman who has caught your eye? Clara denies it. She is a poor liar, but she has learned to hide her feelings behind a mask of indifference. She says nothing about Thomas. She says nothing about the flowers. She says nothing about the love that fills her heart to bursting. But her mother is not convinced. She begins to watch more closely. She notices when Mary goes to the market, when she returns, when she lingers in the kitchen with packages that are not accounted for. She begins to suspect. One day she intercepts a flower. It is a small bouquet, wrapped in brown paper, addressed to Clara in a hand that is not her own. Clara's mother opens it, reads it, and finds nothing. It is just flowers. A rose, a sprig of lavender, leaves of ivy, pretty but meaningless. She does not know the language. She does not know that the rose means love, the lavender means devotion, the ivy means fidelity. She sees only petals. She shrugs, rewraps the bouquet, and gives it to Clara with a warning. Someone is sending you flowers. Do you know who? Clara takes the bouquet with trembling hands. No, mother, I have no idea. She lies, but the lie is necessary. The love depends on it. That night she examines the flowers more closely. There is something different about this bouquet, something hidden. She looks more carefully and she finds it. A single thorn, wrapped in a leaf tucked deep among the stems. The thorn means I am afraid. Thomas is afraid. Afraid that she will be discovered. Afraid that their correspondence will be exposed. Afraid that he will lose her before he has truly had her. She understands. She is afraid too. But fear, she knows, is not a reason to stop. Fear is a reason to be more careful, to be more clever, to be more determined. She sends a reply the next day through Mary, a single snowdrop. Consolation. She tells him without words that she shares his fear but will not let it She tells him that they will find a way. The lovers' trial continues. The stakes rise. The danger grows. But the flowers keep speaking and the lovers keep listening. And for now, that is enough. The summer advances. The days grow longer, warmer, more dangerous. Clara and Thomas have developed a system. Mary carries the flowers, but she does not carry them directly. That would be too obvious. Instead, she leaves them in a hollow tree in Sydney Garden, a public park where lovers walk on Sunday afternoon. Thomas retrieves them at dusk. He leaves his own flowers in the same hollow, and Mary collects them the next morning. It is a system that depends on trust, on timing, on the hope that no one else will discover their secret post office. Clara visits the hollow whenever she can. She pretends to walk in the gardens for her health, for fresh air, for the simple pleasure of being outdoors. Her mother sometimes accompanies her, sometimes does not. On the days when she is alone, Clara allows herself a moment of pure joy, the moment when her hand closes around the small package wrapped in brown paper, the moment when she knows that Thomas has spoken again. The flowers accumulate in her dictionary. She presses them carefully, labeling each one with the date and the meaning she and Thomas have agreed upon. The dictionary is no longer just a book. It is a chronicle of their love, a record of every message, every hope, every fear. In June, he sends a sprig of honeysuckle. Bonds of love, she understands. He is asking her to commit, to bind herself to him, to promise that she will wait for him no matter what. She sends a sprig of myrtle in return. Marriage. It is the boldest message she has ever sent. It is a promise, a declaration, a future spoken in a single stem. He replies with a white rose. I am worthy of you. He is telling her that he will work, will strive, will become the kind of man her parents might someday accept. He is telling her that he will not give up. The lover's trial is also a trial of patience, of hope, of faith that the future will be kinder than the present. But the present is not kind. In July, Clara's mother announces that a suitor has been found. A Mr. Ashworth, a wealthy merchant from Bristol, a man of 40 with a thriving business and a desire for a young wife. He has seen Clara at church. He has made inquiry. He has proposed. The proposal is not made to Clara. It is made to her father. The terms are discussed in the study, over glasses of port, while Clara waits in the parlor, her hands clenched in her lap, her heart pounding. She is summoned. She is told of the offer. She is expected to be grateful. She is not grateful. She is horrified, but she cannot say so. She cannot refuse. A daughter does not refuse a suitable offer from a respectable man. A daughter does not have choices. A daughter does what she is told. She nods. She murmurs something about being honored. She retreats to her room and locks the door. That night she sends a message through Mary. Not a flower this time, but a note. A desperate, dangerous note written in haste, hidden in the hollow tree. It says only, "They have chosen another. What do I do?" The answer comes the next day. A single flower wrapped in brown paper left in the hollow. It is a sprig of wallflower. Fidelity in adversity. Thomas will wait. Thomas will be faithful. Thomas will not abandon her, even if the world tries to tear them apart. Clara holds the wallflower to her lips. She weeps. She does not know how they will survive this trial. She does not know how she will survive the years ahead. But she knows with a certainty that nothing can shake that she is loved, that she is not alone, that the flowers will keep speaking, even when she cannot. The lover's trial continues. The stakes have never been higher, but Clara has her wallflower, and she has hope. The engagement to Mr. Ashworth proceeds with the grim inevitability of a machine. There are visits to be made, calls to be paid, arrangements to be discussed. Clara sits through it all in a daze, smiling when she is expected to smile, speaking when she is expected to speak, playing the part of the happy bride-to-be. Inside, she is elsewhere. Inside, she is in the garden with Thomas, with the flowers, with the only language that speaks the truth. She continues to visit the hollow tree. She continues to leave and receive messages, but it is harder now. Her mother watches her constantly, suspicious of her distracted air, her frequent walks, her unexplained absence. Mary is watched too. The servants have been warned to report anything unusual. The risk is immense. If they are discovered, Clara will be ruined. Thomas will be banned from Bath. Mary will lose her position. The love that has sustained them through the summer will be destroyed. But they cannot stop. The need to speak is stronger than the fear of discovery. In August, Thomas sends a message that chills Clara to the bone. It is a single flower, one she has never received before, a yellow carnation. In their dictionary, the yellow carnation means disdain, but Thomas would never send disdain. There must be another meaning. She consults her dictionary. The entry for yellow carnation is ambiguous. Disdain in some books. You have disappointed me in others. But in the marginal notes she and Thomas have added in the private code they have built together, the yellow carnation means something else entirely. It means I must see you. It is urgent. Her heart pounds. Something has happened. Something has gone wrong. She sends a reply the next morning, a sprig of feverfew. In their private code it means I will come. Where? The answer comes that evening, a sprig of meadowsweet. The garden's dusk tomorrow. Clara does not sleep that night. She lies awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining 100 different disasters. He has been discovered. He is leaving Bath. He is giving up. He is saying goodbye. She cannot bear it, but she must. The next evening she pleads a headache and retreats to her room. She waits until the house is quiet, until her parents have retired, until the servants have finished their work. Then she slips out the back door, through the garden, into the alley and towards Sydney Garden. The moon is full. The paths are silver. She reaches the hollow tree and waits. He comes out of the shadow. He looks older, thinner, more desperate than she remembered. He takes her hands. He speaks. I have been offered a position in London, on a newspaper there. It is a chance, a real chance, to make something of myself, to become the kind of man your father might accept. Clara's heart leaps. This is not disaster, this is hope. But I must leave next week, and I cannot ask you to wait for me. It could be years before I am established, years before I can return and claim you. She shakes her head. She cannot speak. She takes his hand and leads him to the hollow tree. She reaches inside and pulls out a flower she left there earlier, before she knew he would come. It is a sprig of ivy, fidelity. She gives it to him. She meets his eyes, and for the first time she speaks aloud the words she has only written in flowers. I will wait, however long it takes, I will wait. They stand there in the moonlight, two figures in a garden, holding flowers that speak what they cannot say. The lover's trial is far from over. The years ahead will be long and hard and full of doubt. But in this moment, under the full moon, surrounded by the silent language of the garden, they are together. They are true. They are love. And that is enough. Thomas leaves for London on a gray morning in late August. Clara does not see him go. She cannot. She is confined to the house, preparing for yet another visit from Mr. Ashworth, who arrives that afternoon with a gift of expensive French perfume and a conversation about the size of the house he plans to buy for them in Bristol. Clara smiles, nods, accepts the perfume. She is a professional now at the art of hiding. But that night, when the house is finally quiet, she slips out to the hollow tree. There is a package waiting for her, left by Thomas before he departed. She opens it with trembling hand. Inside is a single flower pressed flat and wrapped in tissue paper. It is a sprig of rosemary, the flower of remembrance, but tucked beneath it is something else. A small piece of paper, folded tightly, sealed with wax. She breaks the seal. She reads the words by moonlight. My dearest Clara, I will write to you through Mary, who has promised to carry our letters as she carried our flowers. I will send you news of London, of my work, of my progress. And I will send you flowers whenever I can, flowers that speak the words I cannot write. Wait for me. I will return. I will always return. Your Thomas. She presses the letter to her heart. She places the rosemary in her dictionary next to the wallflower, next to the ivy, next to all the flowers that chronicle their love. She is crying, but they are not tears of sorrow. They are tears of hope, of gratitude, of love. The lover's trial continues. It will continue for years. But Clara has her dictionary. She has her flowers. She has the memory of that moonlit garden and the promise of a future that might still be theirs. The months pass. The letters arrive, smuggled by Mary, hidden in the hollow tree. Thomas writes of London, the fog, the crowds, the noise, the excitement. He writes of his work, his struggles, his small triumphs. He writes of his love, always his love, in words that Clara reads over and over until she knows them by heart. And the flowers arrive too. A snowdrop in winter for consolation, a violet in spring for faithfulness, a rose in summer for love. Each one pressed in the dictionary, each one dated and labeled, each one a testament to a love that refuses to die. Mr. Ashworth continues his courtship. The wedding is planned for the following spring. Clara plays her part, smiles her smiles, speaks her line, but inside she is elsewhere. Inside she is in London with Thomas. Inside she is free. The lover's trial is a trial of patience, of endurance, of faith. Clara does not know if she will ever see Thomas again. She does not know if he will succeed, if he will return, if they will ever be together. But she knows that she loves him. She knows that he loves her. And she knows that the flowers will keep speaking, even across the distance, even through the year. That knowledge is enough. It has to be. The spring of 1849 arrives. The wedding is a month away. Clara has run out of time. She sends a final message to Thomas through Mary, through the hollow tree. It is not a flower this time. It is a cry for help. I am to be married in 4 weeks. If you are coming, come now. If not, I will understand. But I needed you to know that I have waited. I have always waited. I will always love you. The days pass. No reply. Clara's hope begins to fade. And then 3 days before the wedding, a package arrives. It is larger than usual, wrapped in brown paper, addressed in a hand she knows. She opens it in secret in her room, with Mary keeping watch at the door. Inside is a bouquet, a tussy-mussy arranged with care. At the center, a red rose, love. Surrounding it, ivy, fidelity, myrtle, marriage, forget-me-nots, true remembrance. And at the edges, a flower she has never seen before, a flower she cannot name. Tucked beneath the bouquet is a letter. My dearest Clara, I have returned. I am in Bath. I have a position, a future, a hope. I am not the man your father wanted, but I am the man who loves you. Meet me in Sydney Gardens at the hollow tree at dusk tomorrow. If you come, we will face them together. If you do not come, I will understand. But I had to try. I had to offer you a choice. Your Thomas. Clara reads the letter 3 times. She holds the bouquet. She touches the unfamiliar flower, the one she cannot name. And then she understands. It is a flower of her own invention. A flower that exists only in the language she and Thomas have built together. It means the choice is yours. I will love you either way. She makes her choice. The next evening at dusk, she walks to Sydney Garden. She does not sneak. She does not hide. She walks openly through the front door, past her mother's astonished gaze, into the street, toward the park, toward the hollow tree, toward Thomas. He is waiting. He takes her hands. He does not speak. He does not need to. They walk back to her parents' house together. They face the storm together. The shouting, the tears, the threats, the recrimination, the scandal, the shame, the social ruin. They face it all. And they survive. Clara and Thomas marry in a small ceremony, with only Mary and a few friends as witnesses. They move to London, where Thomas's career flourishes and Clara becomes a writer herself, chronicling the language of flowers in a book that will be published years later, under a pseudonym. They live long lives. They have children and grandchildren. They grow old together. And every year on the anniversary of that first meeting, Thomas gives Clara a bouquet, a tussy-mussy, arranged with care, speaking the words that still need to be spoken. The lover's trial is over. Love has won. But the flowers, of course, keep speaking. They always will. The world changes. It always does. We have been living in the long afternoon of the Victorian age. The gaslight, the crinoline, the silent parlors, the speaking flowers. But afternoons do not last forever. The light begins to fade. The shadows lengthen. And a new world rises to take the place of the old. Let us mark the moment of change. Let us find the exact point where the language of flowers begins to wilt. It is not a single moment it is 1,000 small moments, a gradual shift, a slow fading. But if we must choose a symbol, let us choose the telephone. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell speaks the first words over his new invention. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." It is a mundane message, a call for help, but it carries within it the seed of revolution. For the first time, human speech can travel across distance, instant and alive. The voice, once confined to the range of the lungs, can now leap across cities, across countries, across the world. What need, then, for silent messages? What need for flowers that speak when the voice itself can travel? The telephone is followed by the typewriter, the telegraph, the mass circulation newspaper. Communication becomes faster, cheaper, more accessible. The secrets that once required elaborate codes and hidden bouquets can now be whispered directly into a receiver, typed onto a page, printed for millions to read. The world speeds up, and the language of flowers, born of silence and patience, cannot keep pace. The flower dictionaries, once bestsellers, begin to gather dust on bookstore shelves. New editions are printed, but fewer people buy them. The young women who once memorized the meanings of roses and lilies now spend their time learning to type, to telegraph, to speak directly into the new machine. The language of flowers becomes a curiosity, a relic, a thing of the past. By the 1890s, the craze is over. The dictionaries are still published, but they are aimed at nostalgists, at collectors, at those who cling to the old ways. The language is no longer a living thing. It is a museum piece, preserved in amber, waiting to be discovered by a future generation that will not understand what it meant. The gardens, of course, do not change. The roses still bloom. The lilies still open their white faces to the sun. The tuberose still releases its narcotic fragrance at midnight. But the meanings have faded. The flowers are just flowers again. The silence that the language was born to break returns. But it is a different silence now. It is the silence of abandonment, of forgetting, of a language that no one speaks. The young woman with the herbarium, she who was Clara in our story, she who loved and waited and won, is old now. Her children are grown. Her grandchildren play in the garden where she once received forbidden flowers. She tries to teach them the language, but they are not interested. They have bicycles and telephones and a world that moves too fast for flowers. She closes her dictionary. She places it on the shelf, next to the herbarium, next to the pressed flowers that chronicle her love. She knows that she is the last speaker of a dying language. She knows that when she dies, the language will die with her. Or so she believes. But languages do not die easily. They linger, they hide, they wait for resurrection. In the early years of the 20th century, the language of flowers found a new home. In the novels and poems of writers who remembered the old ways, the Brontes had used it. Of course, Heathcliff and Catherine speak as much through the moors as through their words. But now, a new generation of writers began to weave Floriography into their work, preserving it in fiction even as it faded from life. Virginia Woolf, in her novels, fills her gardens with flowers that carry meaning. E.M. Forster, in A Room with a View, sends his characters into fields of violets that speak of passions too deep for words. The language becomes literary, symbolic, a tool for writers rather than a code for lovers. And then in the decades that followed, the language found another home, in the language of mourning. The First World War, that cataclysm that swept away the old world entirely, created a new need for silent communication. The mothers who lost sons, the wives who lost husbands, the sweethearts who lost lovers, they returned to the flowers, placing them on graves, pressing them in Bibles, using them to speak the grief that words could not contain. The red poppy became the symbol of remembrance, worn on lapels every November, a flower that spoke of blood and sacrifice in the hope of peace. The language of flowers, which had seemed so frivolous, so feminine, so Victorian, found a new purpose in the trenches of the Western Front. And in the gardens of England, the old meanings lingered. Old women, the last survivors of the Victorian age, still spoke to their flowers, still gave them as gifts, still pressed them in books. They were the keepers of the flame, the guardians of the language, the ones who remembered when a rose meant love and a lily meant purity and a yellow carnation meant disdain. They are all gone now. The last of them died in the mid-20th century, taking their knowledge with, or so we think. But the flowers remain. The roses still bloom. The lilies still open. The tuberose still releases its fragrance at midnight. And somewhere in a dusty archive, in a forgotten library, in an attic filled with the detritus of generations, the dictionaries survive. The language is not dead. It is sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it. Let us visit a library. It is a small library in a small town, far from the great cities where history is made. The building is old, Victorian, with high ceilings and tall windows and the smell of paper and dust. The librarian is a young woman, barely out of university, who came here because she loved books and because the quiet suited her. She is cataloging a donation, a collection of books from an old house that is being cleared for demolition. Most of them are unremarkable, novels from the 1920s, gardening manuals, a Bible with a cracked spine. But one book catches her eye. It is small, leather-bound, with gilt edges that have faded to a dull gold. The title is stamped on the spine, The Language of Flowers. She opens it, curious. Inside, the pages are filled with more than the printed text. There are annotations, handwritten in faded ink, in a script that is careful and elegant and clearly old. Next to each flower, the original owner has added notes, personal meanings, private interpretations, memories of when this flower was sent or received. The librarian reads, "Red rose, love. He sent me this on the day we met. I have kept it always. Harebell, grief. The year he went away. I did not think I would survive. Wallflower, fidelity in adversity. I waited. He returned. The wallflower was right. Forget-me-not, true remembrance. He sends me one every year on our anniversary. I send him one in return. We are both old now, but we still remember." The librarian turns the pages, her heart beating faster. She has found something, something precious, something that was meant to be found. At the back of the book, pressed between the final pages, are flowers, dried, faded, almost dust, but still there, still visible, still speaking. She recognizes some of them. A rose, a violet, a sprig of lavender. Others she cannot name. They are flowers that no longer grow in gardens, perhaps, or flowers that only grow in memory. She closes the book carefully. She holds it in her hands, feeling its weight, its age, its significance. She knows that she has become, in this moment, the keeper of a secret, the guardian of a language, the inheritor of a love that spanned decades and spoke in flowers. She does not know the woman who owned this book. She does not know the man who sent the roses, the harebells, the wallflowers. But she knows, with a certainty that surprises her, that she will keep this book, that she will study it, that she will learn its language. The language of flowers is not dead. It is sleeping. And in the hands of a young librarian in a small town, in a library that smells of paper and dust, it begins to wake. The young librarian's name is Eleanor. She is 23 years old, the same age as the woman who once owned the annotated dictionary, Clara, whose name she discovers written on the inside cover in that same careful hand. Eleanor becomes obsessed. She spends her evening reading the dictionary, studying the annotations, trying to understand the woman who filled its margins with the story of her life. She learns that Clara loved a man named Thomas, that they were separated, that they corresponded through flowers, that they were reunited against all odds, that they married and lived long lives together. The evidence is all there in the margins, the dates, the names, the flowers. Alina begins to research. She visits the local archives, reads old newspapers, traces census records. She finds Thomas, his name, his occupation, his address. She finds their marriage certificate, dated 1849, in a church that still stands at the edge of the city. She finds the record of their children, their grandchildren, their long and ordinary lives. And she finds Clara's grave. It is in a small churchyard not far from the library. The headstone is weathered, the inscription barely readable, but someone has placed flowers on it, fresh flowers, recently. Alina kneels beside the grave. She looks at the flowers. A red rose, a sprig of ivy, a forget-me-not. Someone else knows the language. Someone else is still speaking to Clara. She looks around, but the churchyard is empty. The afternoon is quiet. The only sound is the wind in the yew tree. She returns the next day at the same time. The flowers are still there, beginning to fade. She waits. She watches. And then she sees her. An old woman walking slowly through the churchyard, leaning on a cane. She carries a small bouquet, fresh flowers just picked. She approaches Clara's grave, kneels with difficulty, and places the bouquet beside the others. Alina approaches carefully. She does not want to startle the old woman. She clears her throat softly. The old woman looks up. Her eyes are pale blue, watery with age, but sharp. She looks at Alina, at the book in Alina's hands, Clara's dictionary, and she smiles. "You found it," she says. "I wondered who would." Alina is confused. "Found it, you mean, this book?" The old woman nods. "I left it in the house when they cleared it. I couldn't bear to throw it away, but I couldn't keep it either. I thought someone should find it, someone who would understand." Alina sits beside her on the grass. "Who are you?" The old woman looks at the grave. "I am Thomas and Clara's granddaughter. My name is also Clara. They named me for her. And she taught me the language. She taught me everything." Alina opens the dictionary. She turns to the annotated pages, the pressed flowers, the story of a love that spanned decades, and she realizes that she is not the inheritor of this language. She is merely its latest student. The true inheritor is sitting beside her, placing flowers on her grandmother's grave, keeping the conversation alive. The old Clara reaches out and touches the book. "She would be glad you found it. She always hoped someone would carry it on. The language, I mean. She knew it was dying. She knew the world was changing. But she believed that somewhere, somehow, someone would keep speaking." Alina looks at the flowers on the grave. The red rose, the ivy, the forget-me-not. She understands now. They are not just flowers, they are messages. They are love still speaking across the years. "Will you teach me?" she asks. "The language, will you teach me?" The old Clara smiles. She takes Alina's hand, and in the quiet churchyard with yew trees whispering overhead, the lesson begins. The language of flowers is not dead. It is sleeping, and in the hands of two women, young and old, sitting beside a grave, it begins to wake. The years pass. Alina learns the language. She learns it from the old Clara, who learned it from her grandmother, who learned it from a dictionary and a lover, and a lifetime of speaking in flowers. She learns the public meanings and the private ones, the dictionary definitions and the family secrets. She learns which flowers were sent on which occasion, which meanings were invented by Clara and Thomas for their own use, which flowers were pressed and preserved and why. She becomes fluent. She becomes a speaker of the language, and she begins to use it. She sends flowers to her mother to tell her she is loved. She sends flowers to her friends to celebrate their joys and mourn their sorrow. She sends flowers to a young man she meets at the library, a fellow lover of books and quiet afternoons, and she watches his face as he receives, wondering if he will understand. He does not understand, not at first, but he wants to. He asks her about the flowers, about their meanings, about the language she speaks. She teaches him. They learn together. And slowly, imperceptibly, they begin to build their own private dictionary, their own shared language, their own way of speaking without words. They marry, as Clara and Thomas married, in a small ceremony with flowers everywhere. Their wedding bouquet is a tussy-mussy, arranged according to the old rules, speaking the old words: love, fidelity, remembrance, hope. The old Clara, now very old indeed, attends the wedding. She holds Alina's hand and whispers the meanings of the flowers, though Alina knows them already. The language lives. Alina becomes a teacher, not in a classroom, she is too shy for that, but in the quiet way of those who pass on what they love. She gives dictionaries to young couples, to grieving friends, to anyone who seems to need a way to speak. She shows them how to press flowers, how to arrange them, how to read. She keeps the language alive, one student at a time. And when the old Clara dies, Alina inherits more than the dictionary. She inherits the responsibility, the duty, the joy of keeping the language spoken. She visits Clara's grave regularly as the old Clara visited her grandmother. She brings flowers. She speaks the language. She keeps the conversation going. The language of flowers is not dead. It is sleeping. But in the hands of those who love it, it wakes. It speaks. It lives. And it will live as long as there are hearts that need to speak without words. The dictionary sits on a shelf in Alina's study. It is old now, fragile, its leather cover cracked with age, its pages brown at the edges. But it is still readable. The annotations are still visible. The pressed flowers, protected by tissue paper, are still there, faded, yes, but present. Witnesses to a love that ended long ago but refuses to be forgotten. Alina is old now herself. She has lived a long life, a full life, a life shaped by the language she learned from the old Clara in that churchyard so many years ago. She has taught the language to her children, to her grandchildren, to anyone who would listen. She has given away dozens of dictionaries, each one annotated with her own meanings, her own memories, her own pressed flowers. But this dictionary, Clara's dictionary, she has kept for herself. It is the original, the source, the foundation of everything she knows and loves. She takes it down from the shelf carefully, reverently. She turns the pages slowly, pausing at each pressed flower, each annotation, each glimpse into a life that ended before she was born. She comes to the final page. There, pressed between the last leaf of the book, is a flower she has never noticed before. It is small, brown with age, almost invisible. She lifts it carefully, holds it to the light. It is a forget-me-not. Beneath it in Clara's hand is a final annotation. For the one who finds this book after I am gone, remember me, remember us. Remember that love speaks in many languages and that flowers are among the most faithful. If you are reading this, you are now the keeper of our story. Tell it, pass it on. Let the language live. Yours in eternal remembrance, Clara. Alina reads the words 3 times. Tears fill her eyes. She has kept the story. She has passed it on. She has let the language live. But there is more to do. There is always more. She takes out her pen. She adds her own annotation below Clara's in her own careful hand. I found it, I remembered, I told the story. And now I pass it to you, whoever you are, wherever you are, whenever you find this book. The language is yours now. Speak it, love it, pass it on. The flowers will always be waiting. In eternal remembrance, Alina. She closes the dictionary. She places it back on the shelf. She knows that she will not be here forever. She knows that one day someone else will find this book, a granddaughter, a stranger, a librarian in a small town, and they will discover the annotations, the pressed flowers, the story of a love that spans generations. And they will have a choice. They can close the book and forget it, or they can open it, learn it, and let the language live. Alina hopes they will choose to let it live. The afternoon light fades. The study grows dim. Alina sits in her chair, the dictionary on the shelf beside her, and she thinks about Clara and Thomas, about the old Clara in the churchyard, about all the lovers who have spoken in flowers over the century. She thinks about the millions of messages sent and received, the millions of hearts that found a voice in petals, the millions of silences broken by a single bloom. The language of flowers is not dead, it is sleeping, but in the hands of those who love it, it wakes, it speaks, it lives, and it will live as long as there are hearts that need to speak without words. Alina closes her eyes. She is tired, but she is content. She has done what she was meant to do. She has kept the language alive. Outside in the garden, the flowers are blooming. The roses, the lilies, the forget-me-nots, they are waiting. They are always waiting, ready to speak again. Let us return, one final time, to the garden. It is dusk. The light is soft, golden, fatting. The air is cool and still, carrying the scent of roses and damp earth and something else. Something that might be memory, or might be longing, or might simply be the way gardens smell at the end of the day. We are standing in a garden that has been loved for a very long time. The paths are worn smooth by generations of feet. The walls are covered with ancient ivy, its stems thick as wrists. The flowers, Roses, lilies, lavender, forget-me-nots have been planted and replanted, tended and cherished for more than a century. This garden belonged to Clara and Thomas. They planted it together in the first years of their marriage when they were young and hopeful and full of dreams. They filled it with the flowers that had spoken for them during their long separation, the roses of love, the ivy of fidelity, the forget-me-nots of remembrance. They added new flowers as the years passed, new meanings, new memory. Clara died first in her sleep at the age of 80. Thomas followed her a year later, as if he had only been waiting for permission to go. They are buried together in the churchyard down the road, under a single headstone carved with roses and the words, "Together at last." But the garden remains. Eleanor, the young librarian who learned the language from their granddaughter, has cared for it in her old age. She has kept the paths clear, the flowers blooming, the memory alive. She is gone now too, died peacefully, in the same chair where she used to read Clara's dictionary, surrounded by her own children and grandchildren. But the garden remains. And now at dusk we are here, alone listening. The ghosts are here. We cannot see them, but we can feel them. They are in the scent of the roses, in the whisper of the wind through the lavender, in the way the light falls across the path. They are the lovers who spoke in flowers, the mourners who found consolation in petals, the madwomen who traced invisible blooms on asylum bedsheets, the librarians who kept the language alive. They are all here, in this garden at this moment, and they are speaking. Listen. Can you hear them? The wind moves through the roses, and it sounds like a voice, soft, distant, almost intelligible. It might be saying a name. It might be saying a word in the language of flowers. It might be saying something we cannot quite catch, something just beyond the edge of hearing. The lavender rustles, and it sounds like a sigh. The forget-me-nots tremble, and it sounds like a whisper. The yew trees, dark and ancient at the edge of the garden, creak in the wind, and it sounds like a prayer. The ghosts are speaking. They are speaking the only language they ever truly knew. They are telling their story. The young woman who loved a man her father forbade. The mother who buried a child and covered the grave with snowdrops. The governess who sent a bouquet and was locked away for her trouble. The nurse who brought flowers to a madwoman and learned the language of the unheard. The lovers who waited years, who exchanged messages through a hollow tree, who finally found each other against all odds. They are all here. Their voices are faint, but they are real, and they are saying the same thing, over and over, in 1,000 different ways. We loved, we lost. We spoke when we could not speak, we found a way. The garden listened. The garden remembered. The garden holds their voices in its petals, its leaves, its roots. The garden is a library of the heart, and every flower is a book, and every book is a story, and every story is true. We stand in the fading light, surrounded by ghosts, surrounded by flowers, surrounded by love. We do not need to see them to know they are here. We do not need to hear them to know they are speaking. We only need to listen. The light fades further. The stars begin to appear one by one in the darkening sky. The garden grows quiet, as gardens do at night, settling into sleep. But the ghosts do not sleep. They are always here, always watching, always waiting for someone to listen. We are the ones they have been waiting for. We are the ones who found their story, who followed their path, who came to their garden at dusk. We are the ones who will carry their language forward, who will speak it when they cannot, who will remember them when everyone else has forgotten. The language of flowers is not a relic of the past. It is a living thing, as alive as the roses that bloom in this garden, as alive as the love that brought Clara and Thomas together, as alive as the hope that sustains every heart that has ever loved and lost and loved again. We can speak it. We can learn its meanings, its grammar, its secrets. We can send flowers to those we love, not as a fashionable gesture, but as a true message, a message that says what words cannot say. A red rose for love, a sprig of ivy for fidelity, a forget-me-not for remembrance, a wallflower for fidelity in adversity, a tuberose for dangerous pleasures, a yellow carnation for disdain, a marigold for grief, a snowdrop for consolation, a harebell for bowed but not broken, a white rose for I am worthy of. The dictionary is open, the language is waiting, the ghosts are watching. What will you say? The garden is dark now. The last light has faded from the sky. The flowers are invisible, their colors swallowed by the night. But we can still smell them. The roses, the lavender, the tuberose. Their fragrance hangs in the air, heavy and sweet, a reminder that they are still there, still blooming, still speaking. We stand at the gate, ready to leave. The garden will remain, waiting for the next visitor, the next listener, the next speaker of the language. The ghosts will remain, watching, whispering, hopping to be heard. We have been here, we have listened, we have learned, and now we carry the language with us, out of the garden, into the world, into our own lives. We carry it in our hearts, in our memories, in the flowers we will give and receive in the days to come. The language of flowers is not a secret anymore. It is a gift from the past to the present, from the dead to the living, from the lovers who came before to the lovers who are yet to come. We are the inheritors of that gift. We are the speakers of that language. We are the ones who will keep it alive. The gate closes behind us. The garden disappears into the darkness. But the scent of roses lingers, following us down the path, into the night, into the future. The ghosts are smiling, they have been heard, and the flowers, as always, are still speaking. Let us end where we began. A room dimmed by velvet curtain, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and fatting potpourri, a single gas lamp hissing softly on a mahogany table. Outside, the London fog presses against the window like a ghost trying to find a way in. But now, we understand what we did not understand before. The woman in the room, holding a dried blossom in her gloved hand, is not alone. She is surrounded by ghosts, the ghosts of all the lovers who have spoken in flowers, all the mourners who have found consolation in petals, all the madwomen who have traced invisible blooms on asylum bedsheets. They are with her in the room, in the candlelight, in the flower she holds. She is not just reading a message, she is continuing a conversation that began centuries ago, in the harems of Constantinople, in the parlors of Victorian London, in the gardens of Bath and Yorkshire and 1,000 other places. A conversation that has been carried forward by countless hands, countless hearts, countless flowers. She is part of that conversation now, and so are we. The flower she holds, a heliotrope, means devotion, but it also means something more. It means I am part of something larger than myself. I am connected to all the lovers who have come before. I am speaking a language that will outlive me. She places the flower in her dictionary next to the others. She closes the book. She blows out the candle. The room is dark now. The fog presses against the window, but the flowers are still there, in the dictionary, in the garden, in the hearts of all who have learned to speak their language. They are waiting. They are always waiting, ready to speak again. The garden at dawn. The first light touches the highest leaves, the tips of the roses, the edge of the garden wall. The flowers begin to open, one by one, greeting the sun. The dew glistens on their petals like tears, like memory, like hope. A woman walks through the garden. She is young, though we cannot see her face clearly. She carries a small basket, and in the basket are scissors and ribbon and a dictionary. An old dictionary, leather-bound, its pages filled with annotations and pressed flowers. She stops at a rose bush. She cuts a single bloom, a red rose, for love. She adds a sprig of ivy from the wall, fidelity. She adds forget-me-nots from the border, remembrance. She arranges them carefully, ties them with ribbon, holds them to the light. She is making a tussy-mussy. She is composing a message. She is speaking the language. Who is she sending it to? A lover, a friend, a mourner, herself? We do not know, it does not matter. What matters is that she is speaking. What matters is that the language is alive. She leaves the garden, the bouquet in her hand. The gate closes behind her. The garden is empty now, but only of the living. The ghosts are still there, Clara and Thomas, the old Clara and Alina, the madwoman in the white room, the flower lady in the corner, the nurse with her notebook, the librarian in the small town. They are all there, watching, waiting, hopping. They have seen another speaker of their language. They have seen another heart find its voice. They have seen the future of the flowers, and it is bright. The sun rises higher. The garden fills with light. The flowers bloom. And the language of flowers, the secret language of lovers, the art of forbidden blossoms, the dictionary of sorrow, the grammar of the heart, lives on. It will always live on, as long as there is love, as long as there is loss, as long as there are hearts that need to speak without words. The garden waits, the flowers bloom, the ghosts watch, and the language speaks.